Oh! Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is November the 19th, and I hit my head with that book way too hard. We are here to talk about the world. That means current events, foreign policy, economics, world history. Anything goes as long as we can keep some relative calm and peace and respect throughout the discussion. This is meant to be interactive, so if you have questions, you may place them in the Twitch chat or in the YouTube comments later on. Without any further delays, let's begin another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Good evening.
How are you?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
Oh, can't complain, I guess.
Do you want to complain a little bit, though?
Always.
Okay. Appreciate you reining it in a little bit and not just getting on here and complaining for 3 hours. You have a lot of fans. A lot of people ask about you. I had at least 11 people ask about you today. So know that you are sought after. Yeah. They're yelling, "I want Smith." He's in the call now. You can calm down. You have been appeased. We have summoned the man. And there's been things going on. One random question that isn't really current event related. People wanted to know if you've ever been in a mosh pit.
I have not.
You've not been in a mosh pit, okay. Well,
in fact,
I'm probably going to make a mosh pit safety video. So if at some point you find yourself in a mosh pit, just let me know and I will link you that video.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I always appreciate safety tips.
Yeah, for sure. It's just whenever I go into a mosh pit, I see there are like at least 8 people there who really don't know how to do it correctly, and they're causing problems for other people, or they're just super tiny and they don't realize they're 250-pound dudes just throwing their body weight around. So people need to stay safe out there. Yeah, we hit him with the tough question out the gate there. Okay, so that one was asked. He has not been in a mosh pit, confirmed.
Yeah, I haven't even been to a concert in like 25 years. Probably more than that.
What concert was that?
I don't know exactly. I was a kid. This would have been like the mid-90s. So more than 25 years ago, actually. And I don't know, my single mom household, so she wanted to go out and do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But she didn't want to leave me alone. So she went to a concert and took me with her. And I had no idea, like, what the band was. Like, yeah, I wasn't even really I had never been to a concert before. I remember just sitting the whole time wondering why everybody was standing. I didn't really get it. It wasn't my thing. I would have much rather stayed home and just played Super Nintendo. But that apparently was not an option. So I got to channel my inner middle-aged man and just sit through the whole concert, just waiting for it to end, basically.
Sounds like you had the opposite of a great time. He asked himself, why are these people here and not playing Nintendo at home? Maybe they don't have a Nintendo, he thought to himself.
Yeah, I've never been much of an outside cat. It's not my bag. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yep. I went to a show here in Seattle recently that had a pretty active mosh pit. I like the standing room concerts. I prefer that energy to sitting down. One of my friends here, Apoptosis, he also streams. He prefers sitting down for concerts because he can focus on the music more and he doesn't get pushed around and stuff. And you can also sometimes have a better view. So to each their own in that sense. But for certain venues, they don't give you both options. It's just one option of like everyone sitting or everyone standing.
Is there a preference?
For me, I like standing because I want to be moving around during the show if it's a band that I like. Most of the shows that I would want to go to are more upbeat and active in terms of the like musical energy, so people are either dancing or moshing or something to them. But one thing that's really funny about being into black metal and more obscure types of metal is the target audience is almost exactly the same as Dungeons and Dragons nerds. So at the last concert that I went to, there were 2 tieflings, 3 elves, a sorcerer, and a warlock. Just based on their outfit. Like, they had the full robe, they had horns, like, they were all this stuff, and they're just going to a metal show, but that's one of the settings where it's socially acceptable to dress up like that. So that's always cool to see. I do face paint whenever I go to a metal show, because I don't normally get to do that, and it's fun.
Yeah, so you're quite invested in the culture then.
Oh, yeah. I like being in character, too, because sometimes when people talk to you or whatever, there's like am I my normal self, or do I want to be weird and fun? And sometimes I'll just
talk like this the whole time, and that's how they think I talk.
because they're like, hey, do you know what band's playing next?
I have no idea. I'm just here for the last one.
And they would never know.
Yeah, sounds very colorful.
Yeah. Well, if you find yourself in a mosh pit, let us know how it goes.
Probably poorly. I don't think I would hold up well.
It's okay.
Getting fragile in my old age.
I think most people are tougher than they realize. It's just uncomfortable to put yourself in that situation, and oftentimes unfun.
True.
Now Chat wants to drag you into a mosh pit. We're not going to drag him unless he wishes to venture into that experience. We're just a bunch of metal people, so we get excited about that. But for actual world stuff, I do have some initial questions that we got from the chat before we began. Apparently, Javier Milei won the election in Argentina, and he was the outsider candidate. I think we've talked about this a couple times, but a reminder of who this person was?
Yeah, so he's the libertarian minarchist guy who was running for president in Argentina. Argentine politics has been roiled over the past 10 years by successive, well, not even successive, basically a single ongoing economic crisis that ties into overlapping inflation and debt and other issues in the economy. So established political parties have pretty well destroyed their credibility. The center-right did earlier in the decade, and then, well, late in the previous decade, rather, and then more recently, the Peronist political party was back in power, but was largely unable to reverse the trend. And so the public is pretty well fed up, and they decided to go for a wild card. And as far as wild cards go, they don't come much more wild than this guy. You know, he's made a number of highly ideologically charged promises as far as what he would do if he became president.
What are some of them?
Well, he wants to get rid of Argentina's central bank. He wants to loosen up gun laws. Basically, kind of laundry list of prototypical libertarian stuff. You know, looser regulations, lower taxes, all this kind of basically as little government as possible. And it's pretty unusual for Latin America. I mean, libertarianism, I don't think, is that popular there. So it's actually pretty wild to see somebody become president in Latin America who embraces those kinds of ideas. There's certainly been conservative governments in Latin America, but not so much libertarian. That's a new one. So this is going to be a very interesting experiment, to put it mildly. Yeah, I kind of did. Go ahead.
I had a couple things Dagnip is sharing with us. He's the guy with the chainsaw who cloned his dog multiple times and wants to make the selling of organs legal. So yeah, I guess that's what you mean by of wild cards. He is relatively on the wild side.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of discounted his chances. You know, after the first round of voting, he actually didn't do as well as expected. The Peronists actually got more votes than him. And so the projections for the runoff election were that the Peronists would probably get a victory, albeit a narrow one, over Milei. And to everybody's surprise, he actually won. That was announced just a few hours ago. So Argentina is going to have a right-wing libertarian president going forward very soon. Now, keep in mind, in spite of all these outlandish promises that he's making, his ability to actually deliver them is going to be very limited. Because at the same time that elections were held for the presidency, they were also, I believe, holding elections for the legislature. And in the legislature, he basically has very few, if any, natural allies. The establishment political parties are still dominant in the legislature. Mm-hmm. And the legislature itself is divided between a number of political parties. It's not just the two main ones, but also others. So if Milei wants to do pretty much anything, he's going to have to find allies in the legislature, which means he's going to have to build a coalition. I was reading a little bit ago that part of the reason that he was able to win in the second round, that is to say in the runoff election, is that he was able to form a kind of de facto alliance with the conservatives. And I don't know the details of that. I don't know what kinds of quid pro quo are involved with that. But that could be the foundation for a future alliance between Milei's presidency and conservatives in the legislature. So there could be cooperation there. But I don't believe conservatives in the legislature have enough seats to force changes certainly the kinds of changes that Milei has promised. The scope of those changes is so great that you'd probably need something close to a supermajority, since some of them would probably require making constitutional changes, and I don't believe the conservatives have that. You mentioned Dagnip is in chat; he would know better than I would. But yeah, it's not looking like he's going to be able to do like the most radical stuff that he says he wants to do. But he is going to have at least some allies in the legislature as far as just the generically conservative stuff he wants to do. So that could be possible depending on whether the conservatives can get a majority or not in the legislature. So that remains to be seen. I'd have to do more reading to know what the prospects are for that. But certainly, in so much as presidents in Argentina have discretionary power, you can expect a much more conservative, if not radically libertarian, exercise of presidential discretionary powers going forward for the next few years at least. I don't know just how much damage he can do with those. I imagine there would be big backlash if he went too far, and I don't know that Argentina has a presidential system that puts quite as much power in its presidency as, say, the United States does. But certainly, if he wants to, he will have the option to, if not kind of impose his will using executive fiat, he will also have the option of perhaps imposing his will through dubiously legal means, shall we say. It's not as though Argentina doesn't have a history of that, although it's been some decades since anybody tried it. So we'll see. He's a different kind, I would point out here, he's a different kind of radical conservative than Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro was like more hard right conservative, much more ideologically inclined as far as not just social and just political issues, but like historical issues. He believed he said explicitly that military rule in Brazil was a good period of history for Brazil. Which, mind you, this is a period of Brazil's history that involved, as in a number of other countries in the region, the wanton torture and, if not execution, of left-wing dissidents. So a lot of people heard him say that and were very alarmed for obvious reasons. In general, there are people on the far right in Brazil who do not have a positive impression of democracy and have some nostalgia for a more authoritarian period in the country's history. So that's the kind of conservative that is sort of more common in the region. The other guy, Milei, in Argentina, again, he's a much different breed and something kind of new. He's almost more of like an upper middle class variety of ideological conservative that doesn't really have deep roots in the region's political history. So this is very new terrain for Argentine politics, not just because this guy is an outsider who is not a member of one of the main political parties or political coalitions, but also he represents an ideology that has not traditionally had a lot of representation in the region's politics generally. So significant drama incoming, in other words.
It reminds me a little bit of the experience that you have as a voter whenever you see someone who's running for president, say the president of the United States. You've got people like Barack Obama and Trump who both like promise a lot of stuff throughout their campaign, but whenever you get elected, being able to actually deliver means you have to pretty much persuade people who are either on one side or in the middle, which means that you can list off all the things that you would do if you had complete power, but even if you're the executive, you don't have complete power, it's still partial, and you do still need to build coalitions and get people on your side and persuade them and stuff. So if he lists off like 100 different things that he's going to do, he'll probably be able to push through some of them. So just for you as a voter, if you're voting for someone and they promise a bunch of stuff, they won't necessarily get in the item that you're most excited about, even if they have the best intentions to do so.
Yeah, we'll see just how capable he is of doing that. And I don't think he has a lot of history in politics either. So that's also going to be a problem for him, since navigating political systems, building political coalitions, making trade-offs, making political deals, these are all skills that take experience in order to master, and he doesn't really have much of that, as I understand it. Which means that he's going to be moving up the learning curve on the fly, right, on the job, which can be a very hard place to do that. So he may well flounder, even in spite of all the power that he's going to have accrued as president.
We'll see then. I feel like the initial push to go into office is more of like a marketing check, but it's not really a leadership check.
Yeah.
How good are you at getting your name out there and winning the popularity contest versus actually making hard calls on things that you don't want to have to make calls on? That's one of the things that leading a country involves for every single term. Even if you have a relatively peaceful term, there will be some issues that weren't really your issues. And that's one of the things you said to me when I was like, well, I think it would be fun if I ran and I just made my platform about clean water and fast internet. It's like, well, there are still going to be other things that come up, so you need to make sure that you know what you're going to do in those circumstances. So you do need to have a stance on pretty much everything, even if it's not one of your primary issues.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is a pretty broad field in terms of problems that you have to deal with. And if you go in blind, then you're probably going to get hammered. Yeah. Certainly by your political rivals, but also just by the problem itself. Yeah, problems at the national level, even for relatively small countries, tend to be pretty difficult and intractable. And so it helps to have experience and expertise coming in rather than just running into the problem face first and trying to kind of feel your way through. That's probably not going to work out too well. So you were very correct in that regard.
So there was that election. We'll see what happens there. If anyone has more information on it, feel free to share, as always. There was also someone asking about an update on the conflict in Yemen. If you saw anything?
I think there's still a ceasefire. It was agreed earlier this year, or maybe late last year. I don't quite remember. It's really been out of the news for some time. I don't think I've heard much of anything about it for about a year. So I believe that the ceasefire is holding for the most part, but I have not heard any progress in terms of peace talks. So the fighting seems to have subsided, but the war is not over. That remains to be resolved.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the Middle East in general is a pretty volatile place at the moment, as I'm sure people are well aware.
Yeah.
But Yemen is not the hottest spot right now, which I'm sure is very nice for the Yemeni people.
You put it in perspective the other week when you were talking about the size of the area of Gaza and how much relative publicity that conflict gets relative to other conflicts that are going on. That's one thing that we often forget about when we're getting served different news that kind of rises to the surface of whatever platform we're on and what the algorithm is thinking about.
Have you ever heard of truesizeof.com?
I think I have.
And that's the map website where you can like overlay countries over others.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was using that the other day to look at Palestine and try to get an idea of, comparably, like how big is Gaza relative to other territories. And it's about the size of Manhattan. That's a pretty decent corollary, at least from what it seemed. I was only eyeballing it. I wasn't actually measuring it, but just having them side by side, it looked like it was about the same size as Manhattan up in New York. And that's not big. It's maybe bigger than it looks, but it's pretty small overall. It's just an island. So that's basically what Gaza is. And so for all of the drama and all of the all of the violence, I don't want to detract from that, but for all of the drama there, it's all happening just in a very concentrated space. You can definitely find a lot more mayhem on a much larger scale elsewhere in the region.
Were there
Syria,
any
yeah.
substantive updates on that conflict so far?
Which one?
Israel-Palestine?
Oh, no. No, I mean, the Israeli government is still pushing into Gaza. Supposedly they're trying to, kill Hamas militants and dismantle the tunnel network under the territory. I don't know why. They're just going to dig it up again. That is to say, whatever Israel destroys during this operation is just going to get rebuilt later. The Israelis are saying that they're going to take responsibility for security in Gaza permanently. Yeah. Kind of like what happens in the West Bank, where actually, have we ever talked about security in the West Bank before?
I don't know.
Don't think we have. This could be interesting then if we haven't. You may not have heard this before. So, security arrangements in the West Bank were, the current arrangements anyway, were largely negotiated during and after the Oslo Peace Accords back in the 1990s. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up dividing the West Bank into, basically, this is my understanding of it, basically three territories, A, B, C. And I don't remember exactly which is which, but one of them is reserved explicitly for the Israeli government. In other words, the Israeli military and government are solely responsible for security in that particular territory. I think it's A. In another category, it's exclusively the realm of Palestinian security forces. So the Palestinian Authority is the nominal Palestinian government in the West Bank. And in one category, the Palestinian Authority has sole responsibility for security. And then in the other category, it's joint. So both Israeli security forces and Palestinian Authority security forces cooperate to provide security. So that's A, B, C. And, it's kind of controversial because, it kind of makes the Palestinian Authority complicit in the occupation in so much as they're cooperating with the IDF, with the Israeli government and military. So there's not a few Palestinians that don't like it. But the result is that effectively, the Israelis are able to maintain something resembling stability in the West Bank to a degree that they have not done in Gaza. Obviously they pulled out of Gaza like 2006 or whatever, but even before that, it was a pretty hairy place in terms of violence targeting Israelis. So that kind of arrangement seems to be what the Netanyahu government, or the emergency government, I guess technically it is right now. That kind of arrangement is what the Israeli government seems to have in mind for Gaza. They want a similar arrangement where either they split it up between Israeli and Palestinian security forces, or where they just manage security like they do in that one category in the West Bank. Again, I think it's category A. So that has a lot of commentators pretty skeptical, Because again, we've been here before. Israel used to occupy Gaza back in the day. And certainly on the part of the Palestinians, there's very little confidence that they're not going to abuse the shit out of any, authority that they wield in Gaza. Certainly a potential return of settlements is going to be first and foremost in the minds of Palestinians. So it's unlikely people in Gaza are going to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And things are already pretty tense in the West Bank right now. It's less talked about, but violence in the West Bank is actually escalating. And it was actually escalating even before the October raid, even before the conflict in Gaza started. But it's only been escalating since then. And more and more of it is kind of tit for tat. Jewish settlers in the West Bank clashing with Palestinians, attacking them, etc., and then Palestinians retaliating with violence of their own. And there's been a big uptick in raids in the West Bank correspondingly. And of course, each of those raids, which involves, hunting down militants, trying to arrest them, whatnot, each of those is met with escalating degrees of resistance now as well. People throwing rocks, people shooting at the vehicles, what have you. So the security situation in the West Bank is deteriorating, pretty markedly. And if the Israelis do try to enforce a new security regime in Gaza, then there could be, as a result, an even bigger escalation in the West Bank. Probably they'll face resistance from the population in Gaza. They'll start fighting, and that'll lead to tit-for-tat retaliations between the IDF and the Gazan population. But that kind of violence is just going to supercharge Palestinian nationalism and radicalism in the West Bank. So, if Israel goes through this with this plan, they could be facing a much larger uprising, potentially a third intifada, which I don't think the region really needs right now. I don't know. Have we talked about the intifadas before?
What is that again?
So the intifada is Arabic for like rebellion or uprising or something. Chat will be no better than me. But the first intifada was in the late 80s, and that involved the first major rebellion by Palestinians in the occupied territories against Israeli occupation. And the first intifada was somewhat violent, but it also involved, peaceful protests and, other nonviolent type stuff. It was relatively tame to what would come later, which was the second intifada. And the second intifada was totally different. Like the first intifada genuinely surprised the Israelis because they did not think the people in the occupied territories had enough of a national consciousness to really do that. And so that was sort of the first time that the Israeli government really saw that there was enough coherence and unity amongst Palestinians for there to be organized resistance against the occupation. Before it had been the PLO, which, obviously had popular support amongst Palestinians, but also depended disproportionately on foreign assistance. Mm-hmm. The uprising in the late 80s had PLO involvement, but was also just popular. In the occupied territories. It was a popular uprising. So that was the first intifada, and it had much more of a political dimension. The second intifada was basically just like several years of blind rage. Like there was much less political organization. There was a lot more dysfunction. Basically, a number of radical groups in the Palestinian territories instigated it, or at least helped instigate it. They had help from radicals on the Israeli side doing their own part to instigate, but radicals amongst the Palestinians instigated by committing terrorist attacks and otherwise trying to undermine the peace process in the late 1990s. And eventually that spun out into a collapse of the peace talks, and later on which fed into broader support in the Palestinian territories for another violent uprising. But because this one was less organized, it was a lot more focused just on violence. And the result was a torrent of suicide bombings. Like, I don't know how many people remember, I don't know how many people like my age are listening, but if you were around in the year 2000 to maybe roughly the year 2002, 2003, one of the constant things you would see in the news, at least as far as foreign policy, would be suicide bombings in Israel. And it just happened like constantly, like every other week, sometimes every other day. Mm-hmm. The killing was just really bad. And I think we've even had an Israeli in chat before. We've talked about the second intifada before. Mm-hmm. And I think even he mentioned that it was like really scary. and that it had a dramatic effect on their perception of the conflict and of Palestinians generally. So it was a very dramatic, traumatic, and formative period in the conflict. Before then, the conflict had almost been more international, and in so much as it was an asymmetrical conflict, the violence was relatively limited. But in the Second Intifada, it really spun out into extreme terrorism. And from there, it's only kind of deteriorated. It was actually because of the Second Intifada that Israel built the barrier between Israel and Palestine. Before then, there were obviously border checks and roadblocks and et cetera. Just sort of little barriers here and there dividing between Israel and Palestinian territory. But they had not before built an actual giant-ass wall, a huge barrier between the territories. So it was not actually that hard then, before the Second Intifada, as a Palestinian, to travel into Israel illegally, basically. The Second Intifada basically led to the Israelis making that impossible with the system of border fortifications and barricades, the wall, basically, that was constructed afterwards. So, even in terms of the physical geography of the region, the Second Intifada had a dramatic effect. That was a big change in and of itself. So those were the intifadas. These are the big uprisings, and all of them have had major impacts on relations between Israelis and Palestinians and the trajectory of the conflict between them. The First Intifada helped contribute to the talks that resulted in the Oslo Peace Accord. And the Second Intifada basically resulted in the collapse of the progress that had been made in the 1990s. So a Third Intifada, regardless of the effect it has on the ultimate outcome of the conflict or peace talks or whatever, is likely to be extremely violent. If a major uprising occurs with the degree of popular support and participation that the previous Intifadas had, there would be way more destruction than what you're seeing right now in Gaza. It would be a significant escalation. So, right now, people in the West Bank are not there yet, but, as things continue, as the violence continues to escalate, they're incrementally approaching that. So to bring this full circle, this whole tangent basically was me trying to illustrate the potential linkage between Israel finishing its operation, but then following it by establishing a permanent military presence in Gaza, and potentially by doing so instigating a Third Intifada. That was the point I was kind of driving at. Yeah, so the Israelis themselves, I think, know that. I should specify, the Israeli government knows that, because they've also been talking about alternatives. They've been talking about potentially having Egypt annex Gaza, or maybe just taking responsibility for security in Gaza. They've also considered handing responsibility for security in Gaza over to some kind of UN mission, which could perhaps handle it. I even saw an Israeli commentator write an article last week saying that it might be easier to just build a whole ass new island next to Gaza, just off the coast of Gaza, kind of like the artificial islands in the United Arab Emirates, and just move the entire population of Gaza to that island, rather than just trying to rebuild everything in Gaza, because there's just been so much damage from the war. He thinks it might be cheaper just to build a whole ass new set of settlements and cities on a whole artificial island off the coast. So lots of different ideas have been floated. But the trouble is, as you might guess, is that none of them are actually viable, right? The Egyptian government does not want to take responsibility for Gaza. And I would add here, that's not just because they're concerned about the potentially radicalizing effect that introducing a bunch of radical Palestinians into Egyptian society might have. The Egyptian government is still a nominally, quote unquote, secular military junta, and they don't get along with radical jihadis, the Muslim Brotherhood, what have you. And of course, Gaza has been controlled by Hamas, which definitely does have a sort of Islamist tinge to it. So the prospect of introducing Islamists and introducing Islamists to Egypt probably does not seem that attractive a prospect to the Egyptian government. So they're very reluctant to do that. But that's not the only reason they're reluctant to do it. Part of the reason they don't want to do it, besides, two reasons. One, they're afraid that the Israelis will just kick out the population of Gaza into Egypt, and then just Egypt will be stuck with them. and that in turn the Egyptian government will be blamed by pan-Arab nationalists all over the Arab world, including in Egypt, for being culpable in another mass expulsion of Arabs from their own land, in this case Gaza, which is still a very sensitive issue amongst the regular people of the region. So, even really authoritarian countries that have a pretty solid grip on power are still a little wary, of aggravating popular opinion to varying degrees. Sometimes more than others, more so when they've done something that pisses off the public. Maybe then they'll care more. But regardless, it's a sensitive enough issue for Egypt that they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Partly just for that reason. But also, it kind of sets a precedent too. It kind of sets the precedent that every time there's violence in the Palestinian territories, then Israel can just push them out and pawn them off on, that is to say, pawn the population that is resisting or committing acts of violence, depending on your perspective, can just pawn them off to some other Arab country. And that's not a precedent that, Arab countries in the region really want to accept or encourage. They would much rather the Israelis just make concessions and try to deal with the violence that way. That is the preferable option, both politically and practically, for Arab governments in the region. And so that's more what they're leaning on the Israelis to do. But that would not be very satisfying, I guess is the word I would use, for the broader Israeli public. Suffering.
Well, I use the example of 9/11 for the United States, and everyone has their own kind of national examples of tragedy where a bunch of your people were killed in some way, and how there's like a collective desire to have justice for that. And Israel had a major affront against their people. Many people were killed, all of whom were like non-combatants and just innocent people who were at a techno show kind of a thing. So it makes sense that they're gonna want to like seek some justice for the situation, but it's like, how do the reprisals stop? And then, as you're pointing out, Israel is thinking about different solutions to the problem, but no one else really wants to get their hands dirtied if they can avoid it. So it's like, what is the incentive for someone else to step in and be an intermediary in this? It sounds like Israel, when you're giving all these examples of who can manage the Palestinian people, they're like, anyone but Hamas. We'll let Egypt rule here. We'll let whoever, just not them.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? But not a lot of takers. That's the issue. Like, even the UN is reluctant to get involved. The United States, for its part, has kind of been, on the one hand, it's been openly supporting Israel and giving them a lot of diplomatic cover. But from what I've been reading, the Biden administration sort of quietly on the down low has been putting pressure on the Israelis to try to be more reasonable, I guess would be the polite way of putting it. The impolite way is saying, you should stop being dumb about this. This isn't going to work. The Biden administration has proposed that Gaza, more specifically, responsibility for both governance and, governance broadly and security specifically, be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. That, to the minds of the folks in the Biden administration, makes the most sense. Because then you can avoid the prospect of trying to install some kind of unpopular foreign entity into Gaza that the public isn't going to accept. Certainly, there's no such entity that would be less popular than Israel and the IDF. So, the idea that the IDF is just going to stay in Gaza permanently and try to provide security doesn't really make sense, given that the Israelis themselves, certainly Likud, of all parties involved in the conflict, is partly culpable, in the violence happening there. So I don't think the people in Gaza are going to accept that quietly. Most likely that will be resisted violently. And so that will not be sustainable over the long run. And again, I would point out that it was specifically because that was not sustainable before, when Israel was last in Gaza, that they ended up pulling out. And there isn't really much reason to think it would play out differently now. I know people in Israel are all gung-ho about trying to, get rid of Hamas and trying to change the status quo, but the reality is that that's not in the cards. Like, I've seen nothing about Israel's plans for Gaza to suggest they have any real long-term plan. I stand by my earlier prediction regarding the trajectory of the conflict. Israel will go in, thousands of people will die, they'll kill some Hamas members, and then eventually they'll just declare victory and go home. Because realistically, that's the best they can do. It's highly unlikely they're going to be able to kill every member of Hamas, and even if they did, the fundamental driver of the conflict, the reason Hamas was able to gain power in the first place, has been unaddressed. That being, ongoing settlements and the lack of any real progress in the peace progress. Those two factors combined guarantee that regardless of whether Hamas survives the conflict, something like Hamas will end up emerging to take their place.
Yeah. It's kind of making me think of ISIS and power vacuums and the Taliban is how you can remove one group that is currently in power, but as soon as you do, what is going to fill that power vacuum? Because it's going to be something, and it could be something worse than what was there whenever you clean it out.
There's a powerful Darwinian ratchet that plays that is in effect with regard to insurgent groups and terrorist groups and what have you. The more pressure you put on them in the short term, that'll put a crimp in their operations in the short term, but in the medium to long term, that's going to basically teach them how to be more effective. It's almost like bacteria, right? The more you subject it to antibiotics, it'll give you some short-term relief, but eventually it could easily lead to bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And if you do that enough, then eventually you have bacteria that cannot be dealt with, right? Eventually they're just immune to every kind of biotic that you can throw at them. So there's a similar dynamic with terrorist groups where, the more pressure you put on them over time, the smarter and more radical they get over time, because they adapt to what you do to them readily. Even if you manage to dismantle a whole ass terrorist group, people will learn the lessons from them and will adapt them in future iterations. I think the Israeli government, if not the Israeli public generally, really do themselves a disservice by trying to characterize the conflict in Gaza right now as a war. Because it's really not. It's really a counterterrorism operation. That's what they're doing. That is what they are doing. That is what they're doing is at its core. That is weird grammar. But you get the idea. It is fundamentally a counterterrorism operation. And it's going to play out like other counterterrorism operations have in other regions of the world. And I would point out, too, that some of the leading thinkers and scholars in the field of counterterrorism are themselves, Israeli. The IDF, officers in the IDF themselves have produced quite a bit of literature on the subject. And, even they themselves are not optimistic about the prospects for counterterrorism operations of this kind. They themselves believe that a negotiated settlement to the conflict is the only viable long-term solution to the conflict. And one of the tragedies of the Israel-Palestine conflict is that radical actors like Likud ignore that. They explicitly have ignored the military's advice on how to deal with the conflict for political reasons. It is politically beneficial to try to push settlements. And a peace agenda, the peace process does not offer an avenue to accomplish that. A peace process would do the opposite. It would probably stop settlements. It would stop settlement expansion into the territory that Likud calls Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. So Likud has gone out of its way to find ways to undermine and sabotage pretty much any attempt to negotiate a peaceful settlement. They very grudgingly accepted Oslo, but then at the same time, they denounced it at every opportunity. And then when they got back into power in the late 90s, they went out of their way to undermine and sabotage that. We talked about that, in previous recent episodes. And they really haven't changed in that regard. And certainly the present government is even worse in that regard, because it has some of the most radical political actors in Israeli politics. It's almost literally a far-right government right now, technically speaking. So that doesn't really leave much room for optimism. But they have some of the best, most professional officers on the planet. Like, the Israeli military is well respected, and their scholarship on the issue of counterterrorism, as well as just the general conflict between Israel and Palestine, is very good. And it's actually very insightful. I know people are kind of down on Israel and they don't like them because of the conflict, And they think of the IDF as sort of these, heartless monsters that just carpet bomb cities. And that's not really accurate. That's not an accurate portrayal. Like, it is actually a very professional institution. And nobody knows better than the officers in the IDF the limitations of the government's approach to the problem of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But they're just ignored. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, they can give the best critiques that you've ever heard of the conflict, and Likud is just like, that's cute, but we don't really care about that. Yeah, I was reading about, I think it was in The Atlantic recently, I was reading about an Israeli general in his 60s, no less, who during the October raid, he got a call on his phone from, I guess, a friend or something saying, hey, my kids are actually out there on the border with Gaza, and they're in hiding, and they're just imminently in danger. Like, can you do something? And he says, yeah. And he literally drives out there and gets them. Just full stop. Like, going off-road, like using all of his training and whatnot. He actually just infiltrates the area, extracts the kids, and then gets them out. Like, very impressive stuff. And again, this is a guy in his 60s. Like, he's retired. Now, I had not heard that specific story, but what really surprised me is that it was the same guy who several years before, and this was a story I'd heard about, who had been, this was before he retired. He was in the Israeli military. He was up for promotion to one of the highest positions in the IDF. And he actually gave a speech in which he all but denounced the Likud government. He didn't say it in explicit terms, but he made it very apparent that the Israeli government's approach to the Palestine issue was the wrong approach. And he wasn't like a Palestine sympathizer, right? He's fairly hawkish in his own right. But he was professional enough to see that there was no real future for Israel or Palestine on the current track that the Likud government was on. And he just called them out on it. And he ended up being basically fired for it. Like, he didn't get the promotion. He was basically pushed out of the service. And, to be fair, officers are not really supposed to comment on political matters, right? They're supposed to be loyal to the government regardless. That's how it's supposed to work in a liberal democracy. So, but at the same time, it did take some courage there to speak truth to power. Because, the objective reading of Likud's approach to the problem of the Palestinians and the conflict with them, amongst professional analysts, has been pretty negative. Like, they do not think highly of it. So this guy did speak truth to power. He paid the price for it. And despite that fact, he was able to kind of come back even in retirement and continue being a badass. So credit where credit is due. And he's not the only guy like that in the IDF. Sure, they have their fair share of, like, ultra hawks, right? Ultra nationalists, but by and large, it's very professional. And I don't think people arguing about the issue of Israel-Palestine on, social media are really cognizant of that fact. The IDF is actually more of a natural ally to peaceniks on the Israel-Palestine issue than it is an enemy, contrary to what people assume.
Yeah, well, their end game objective is ultimately to protect their people, and that's going to involve de-escalation as the ultimate win, where you can figure out a way to basically cause the enemy that's attacking your people to stop attacking your people. That's how you win. So short-term wise, yeah, you might have to do some operations, but thinking about long-term ways to find some common ground and that kind of thing. But yeah, I can see how there are political hardliners that their goals are not the same as the military's goals, but that's not really something that's talked about maybe as much as it should.
Yeah, it doesn't get much play. But to be fair, if you are a critic of Israel, the IDF's resistance to the Israeli government's approach has not amounted to much. So, I can't entirely blame people for not really caring that much. As much as the IDF may prefer otherwise, they have not been able to stop the Israeli government from taking the tack that it has. So the Biden administration wants to do things more like what the IDF would probably prefer, which is to get the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza, get them governing the territory, and then to try to get Israel and Palestine back on the peace process, to continue negotiations and to try to create a genuinely independent Palestinian sovereign state, a genuinely independent sovereign Palestinian state, rather, and then to come to some kind of final comprehensive agreement after what will probably be protracted talks. So, of course, Likud does not want to do that for the aforementioned reasons. So they've been resisting the Biden administration on this issue. Again, I don't think they're going to realistically be able to just maintain a security presence in Gaza permanently. That just seems unrealistic right now. But for the moment, Netanyahu, perhaps unsurprisingly, is being his characteristic stubborn self and is insisting that that's what they're going to do. So we'll see how things pan out. We're at a disequilibrium right now as far as what's going to happen and as far as plans for the future. You know, the Israeli government wants to do stuff that it can't do. The American government wants them to do stuff that it can do, but, you know, obviously does not want to do. So how do you square the circle there? Mm-hmm. Remains to be seen. I would point out, too, that the Palestinian Authority is itself not very popular amongst Palestinians, something that some of the commentary online doesn't seem aware of. The Palestinian Authority is quite corrupt and, in effect, is a dictatorship. It is not like the living democratic embodiment of the will of the people of Palestine. They had an election like 20 years ago, and then it became basically indistinguishable from a prototypical pan-Arab nationalist dictatorship of a similar vein to that which you see in Egypt now, or to a lesser degree, perhaps the Gaddafi regime in Libya, or the Assad regime in Syria, or the Hussein regime in Iraq. Actually, maybe not so much Iraq. Iraq was Stalinist. That was a whole order of magnitude worse. But yeah, more like Egypt and Syria, maybe. You know, the Palestinian Authority does not really allow protests, certainly not targeting it. And they cooperate quite vociferously with the IDF when it comes to cracking down on dissidents, especially violent dissidents, obviously. So, you know, the PA, because of that, is seen not so much as the voice of the people in Palestine, but more as a tool, if not an extension, of the occupation. You know, basically, they see it as part and parcel of the occupation authorities. And so that is not really conferring much legitimacy on the institution of the PA. And correspondingly, people in Gaza may not accept the PA any more than they would accept the IDF or Egypt or whomever else may try to govern the territory. So that may not even be a viable option going forward. Now, that said, my counter-argument would be, of all the options that have been tabled thus far, the PA in Gaza is probably the most viable one. It's not necessarily good. They probably will be rejected, but at the same time, it's the least bad option. Mm-hmm. You know, even if the PA is not very popular, they do have some legitimacy, and they could try to frame it as the lesser of two evils. You know, if you have to choose between the IDF and the PA is not a bad alternative overall. So it's possible that could work. Not likely, but possible. It's the most possible. So I kind of suspect that, you know, just by sheer force of gravity, you know, the gravity of probability, so to speak, that the Israeli government is going to kind of gravitate towards that option over time. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're ready to announce that yet, or even to admit it to themselves yet, but that's my suspicion. I think that's probably where they're going to end up.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think I was telling Moss Neotech recently that it would be, you know, if the American plan works out, right? So again, the American plan is that the Palestinian Authority is given responsibility for governing Gaza, and that the Israelis in turn re-engage with the peace process. So if that does happen, the irony would be that the October raid would have actually, as a result, ended up doing more to progress the peace process than pretty much the entirety of the past 10-some years of activity in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Which is not a great precedent, and I don't think I would blame the Israeli government for not wanting to indulge that. But at the same time, as discussed, not a lot of options. So, if they do end up going the peace route, as much as they may not want to, they will inadvertently reward Hamas in doing so, even if Hamas may end up getting decimated or destroyed in the process. Getting Israel back into the peace process has been a long-running goal of Palestinians, including Palestinian radicals. So in that sense, they might actually win. So we'll see. As is usual with the conflict, all of the options are bad and everybody is pretty well fucked.
Which of these bad options would you prefer?
We'll see what they go with. Hopefully, whatever they do, fewer people die.
Yeah.
Because there is a good deal of suffering. Ideally, we could do something about that, if nothing else. But alas, conflicts take on a life of their own after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israel-Palestine conflict has been going on for more than a while.
Mm-hmm.
So we're well past the stage where the original genesis of the conflict is necessarily the driver. Certainly
Genesis of the conflict? That's a Bible joke. You can't sneak that past me. Good one.
If it is, it's an accidental one. You know more about the Bible than I do.
It's the first book of the Bible. It's a biblical area. That was a really good joke you accidentally made. Well done.
Well, doesn't Genesis itself mean the creation?
Yeah, it means the beginning. Yeah.
Okay. So my terminology was correct then?
Yes.
Okay.
Good use of the word.
You'll have to teach me the joke. But yeah, conflicts start with people having lines that they will not cross, right? There are nominal rules that people have in place. Mm-hmm. But if a conflict drags on long enough, then those rules invariably end up getting broken. And at this point in the Israel-Palestine conflict, all of the rules have been broken. Mm-hmm. There's very little restraint at this point as far as how far the respective actors are willing to go. I know the Israelis would dispute that. They would say that they've exercised a good deal of restraint. And there is truth to that. There's truth to that is not broadly recognized even. People criticize, again, people say that the IDF is carpet bombing Gaza, which is very obviously not true. So there is restraint being exercised. But I think the Israelis, especially left-wing Israelis, kind of gaslight themselves on that. Yes, the IDF does exercise restraint, but there's much less restraint exercised with regard to the drivers of the conflict, that being the settlements. After Israel conquered the West Bank in the Six-Day War, right back in 1967, the Israeli government had it at its discretion to not allow settlements to be built in the West Bank. But they decided to do that, didn't they? They decided to indulge that wing of Israeli politics. That was a discretionary choice. They could have chosen not to do that, but they did. So that is a lack of restraint. It may not be a lack of restraint with regard to violence, per se, granted. But given how much violence has happened because of the settlements, given just how much of a spoiler the settlements and pro-settler parties have been to the peace process, it can't be denied that those settlements have been culpable, and the decision to allow them has been culpable in a significant amount of the violence involved. Yeah, if you want to go looking for spoilers of peace, definitely check out the Israel-Palestine conflict. You will find a very long list.
Yeah. How to ruin healthy peace negotiations 101, 201, and 301.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no shortage on both sides.
Well, that's the thing about, what is it? The horseshoe theory of radicalization is the people who are the most radical end up kind of horseshoeing around and having a lot of commonalities between them. So the extremists on either side really hate the other side so much that they don't want to make peace. So the escalations of violence make those hardliners happy on both sides. The normal, regular working people who just want to do their job and live life and stuff, they're unfortunately the ones who have to survive this and really fight hard for peace, because that's the thing that you have to break down as an outside participant, I have seen some people in chat today who say they are from Israel, so they would be active participants in the conflict. But for people who are very far from the conflict, you can acknowledge at least that there are well-adjusted, peace-loving individuals of every country and of every ethnicity and of every religion. So to kind of figure out what each side wants in a conflict and to try to make compromises is really necessary to maintaining peace, because once you've lost any linkages and any talks, then that's when the violence just kind of goes to the extreme levels. So we hope that things can simmer down there, but it sounds like it's going to keep boiling for a bit before it simmers.
Yeah, it's going to get worse before it gets better, for sure.
But as I mentioned earlier in the conflict, and I talked with Trisha some about this, there are a lot of other conflicts that are happening at the same time with very similar loss of life that don't get any publicity for a few different reasons. One is maybe they're less linked with our country in terms of news and information, but you linked me an article on Sudan during the week, or no, yesterday, and they've been in a civil war for a while now. And how many people in the chat have actually heard about that? Because I feel like that's one that is equally bad, not to like try to say whose situation is worse, but it's a very bad situation for them, and it doesn't really get anywhere near the same publicity.
Yeah, what did you think of that article?
It was alarming to me because it talked about a lot of the same issues that people in the Israel-Palestine conflict are suffering through, like lack of normal utilities. They don't have access to clean water. They have increased risk of diseases. They don't have like medical support. They're basically at risk of dying at any point due to bombings and just the violence happening around them. And yeah, it's like they're totally out of options. If you're in Khartoum right now, I hope for the best for you, but it is a very rough situation.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
Yeah. Reminded me a little bit of the like news that was happening during the start of the Ukraine war when people were still in cities that were being actively shelled and they couldn't get out. Yeah, chat's saying Sudan has less geopolitical importance than Israel. Yeah, they're not quite as linked to other countries. And then also just the economic throughput of a country and how technology impacts their society is going to have a big influence in how much their news propagates. So in Israel, there's a whole bunch of overlap with gamers and esports. So for us here in this chat, we have relatively more Israeli people than we have Palestinian people. And I think some of that also boils down to spoken languages. There are a lot of people from Israel who speak English. So that means that it's easy for them to jump into StarCraft chats and talk about stuff with us. But yeah, what's the TLDR and what's happening in Sudan?
I don't think anything's changed from last week. Because I think we did discuss it last week, right?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Yeah, so as far as like just the general conflict, it's basically the military fighting against a paramilitary organization that was set to be folded into the military, but which did not want to be folded into the military. Yeah, that paramilitary organization is called the RSF. It had been the Praetorian Guard of the previous president, who alas did not enjoy the full loyalty of the military. And after he was overthrown in mass protests in 2019, the military and the RSF negotiated more or less as equals in peace talks with civilians, or more accurately, representatives of the protesters. And the subsequent peace talks did involve a power-sharing agreement, but as part of that agreement, the RSF was set to be absorbed into the military, which they did not want, and eventually they decided to just flip over the table and fight for full control of the country. So at this point, the civilians and what liberal protesters there were have been completely marginalized. They do not have any armed forces of their own, so they are not really one of the combatants in the conflict. At this point, the civilian population is just fighting for survival. And when I say fighting, I just mean trying to scrap by and not die. You know, again, they're not combatants. The only two combatants in the conflict are the RSF and the army, effectively.
Pronunciation correction, combatants.
Combatants, thank you. So they've been ripping and tearing at each other for the past several years, trying to gain control. But as of yet, there has not been a decisive blow landed by one against the other. And so the conflict has been dragging on correspondingly.
And for like military power check, you said Israel-Palestine is more of a counterterrorism operation because Hamas isn't a large, full-scale country with a military and all that, so it's not fighting on equal terms. But for this conflict, what's the relative strength and tech level of the forces involved?
Low.
Low for both.
Yeah. Yeah, Sudan has never been a particularly wealthy country. It did get a pretty good amount of oil revenue for a while. I think somebody, you mentioned that zero geopolitical significance? Is that what it was said?
That's what someone said, yeah.
Somebody said, okay, that's not entirely true. They actually were a significant oil exporter, so there was some geopolitical significance. The trouble is that the southern part of the country did not want to be a part of Sudan, and eventually they were able to achieve their independence and become what is now called South Sudan, an independent country. And the reason that Sudan was really, really resistant to letting South Sudan go is that most of its oil was actually located in South Sudan. Now, the Sudanese government still gets pretty significant oil revenues just from royalties, because even though the oil was in South Sudan, the pipelines that connected South Sudan to the coast where the oil was exported run through Sudan proper, current modern-day Sudan. And so the Sudanese government has still been able to generate revenue from that. But the amount of revenue has declined over time. South Sudan has kind of descended into varying degrees of violence over time since its independence. It is not a very stable state, unfortunately. And so the result is that oil revenues in Sudan have taken a hit. So it is geopolitically relevant. Certainly if you're China. China was one of the few countries that was willing to deal with Sudan and buy its oil during the Darfur genocide imbroglio way back in the day, 20-some years ago. And as a result, Chinese oil companies, not least of them Sinopec, was able to build a significant market share in the oil industry in Sudan. And so to a degree, you can consider Sudan one of the early countries in Africa to fall under China's influence. And, I don't think the United States did it deliberately per se, but in so much as peeling South Sudan off of Sudan undermined a nominally Chinese-aligned state. That was a nominal win for the United States and for U.S. influence in the region. So there's some relevance. I don't think China and the U.S. are really competing over it, quite honestly, but given that there's oil there is some relevance. There is reason to be interested. I think the reason that maybe Sudan has not been talked about in that regard is because the country that has the most influence in Sudan is probably Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are able to have cultivated relationships with elites in Sudan over time. They have not really delved into the current conflict that much because they don't really care, and because they're already kind of involved in Yemen and Syria and various other hotspots. The United Arab Emirates have not traditionally exercised as much influence in Sudan, but over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, they've actually built a pretty significant portfolio there. And the Emiratis at this point actually have a very close relationship, a relatively close relationship, shall we say, with the RSF. And they have actually, supposedly, they're very cagey about it. They've been supporting them on the down low, but nominally at least, the Emiratis have actually been aiding the RSF in their war effort against the army. Which is not a great look, given that the RSF is the descendant of genocidal militiamen who were wiping out whole communities of ethnic minorities in Darfur 20 years ago. But the Emiratis, for their part, see it as transactional. The RSF and the Janjaweed, as they used to be known, actually fought for the Emiratis in Yemen. The Saudi government is not the only one that is propping up the UN-recognized government in Yemen during the civil war there. The Emiratis also have been propping up various militias of their own that are aligned with them. And in order to bolster them in their war effort against the Houthis, the Emiratis actually paid for Sudanese fighters, specifically Janjaweed, to come and fight in the conflict. And the reward for those fighters has been not only money, but also support now in their civil war against the army. So as far as China and the United States, there's some geopolitical relevance to Sudan, but there's much more geopolitical relevance for Middle Eastern actors, specifically the Saudis and the Emiratis. They're fairly active there. Also, I would point out that the Egyptian government has been supporting the army in the civil war. The Egyptian government does not really like, well, for one, they don't like the look of an army that had controlled a neighboring state being overthrown, because guess who controls the Egyptian government? It's the army. So it's kind of a bad look for them to see other army, that is to say, other military juntas being overthrown. But also, they kind of prefer the army because they see it as a little less aligned with Islamist ideology. You know, the previous government under President Omar Bashir and his RSF forces were not Islamists per se, but they did nominally justify and build campaign platforms off of an Islamist platform. You know, it wasn't real Islamism. They were mostly just corrupt kleptocrats, but they did have an Islamist flavor to their rule. And so the Egyptian government, and more specifically the Egyptian army, is not really comfortable with that.
Would you like an Islamist-flavored kleptocracy?
Well, I don't think anybody wants it, but there's a lot of people who have had it, unfortunately. Not least of them the people of Sudan. But the Egyptian army prefers the army over the RSF because they see it as more aligned with the interests of Egypt in the region, and much less aligned with potential Islamist malcontents, as they are seen in Cairo. So there's a little bit of a proxy war happening in Sudan. There is action happening there. That was a tangent. I was talking about something.
We were talking about Sudan, and I asked about the relative strength of the two.
That's
factions.
what it was. Okay.
Yeah.
I got way off track.
It's okay. We do tangents well here in World Discussion.
Yeah, I think what I was getting at is that they used to have oil revenue, and so they used to have more money to spend on their military forces, but that oil revenue declined significantly because of the whole South Sudan thing, right? So South Sudan left, oil revenue declined, and so money became harder to come by. And so the result is that there was a decline in the quality of forces available to the army and to the RSF for that matter. So that said, basically the Sudanese army is roughly equivalent to your prototypical less developed country army, shall we say. Maybe 20 years ago we would have just said third world army, but that is not entirely the couth term to use these days.
Mm-hmm.
But same idea. Basically, it's heavily dependent on infantry. The army does have some heavy equipment, but it's relatively limited in number. So they've got some heavy artillery, they've got some aircraft, they've got some tanks, but not much. You know, in general, it is an infantry-dependent army for the most part. Now, that said, even though the army doesn't have very many assets of those varieties, the RSF, for their part, has virtually none. So having the hardware at all is a big advantage for the army in the conflict.
Sorry, what hardware did you say that was again?
Artillery, tanks, aircraft,
Gotcha.
for the most part. So the RSF doesn't have any of that. However, what the RSF does have is a large number of very experienced fighters. Again, the RSF is basically just the same thing as the Janjaweed, which again was the Arab militia in Western Sudan that fought a genocidal campaign against local ethnic groups for control of the territory. So they've been fighting against rival militias for a very long time. So even if they don't have a lot of experience fighting armies per se, they are experienced fighters, and so they have an advantage over the army in that regard, because a disproportionate share of the army's fighters are conscripts. They're not people that are really well trained or even really familiar with combat in general.
I feel like we saw that play out in an extent in Iraq or Afghanistan, Taliban taking over, and how there was an army there technically that was installed, but seeing videos of them doing jumping jacks, like, they're not going to do the best in battle. And the people who are Afghanistan, yes, thank you. And then people who have actually had experience, maybe fighting the Soviets or whatever back in the day, they're going to actually know what fighting is like and what it takes, and they're going to have leadership of people who have actually dealt with the just terror of war and combat. So yeah, that makes sense that even though one of the sides is that the RSF is lower tech, they're higher experience, and then the other side is they have the better technology, but their average soldier isn't as experienced.
Yeah, that's a good description. Man for man, the RSF probably has the better fighters, but the Army has the tech. They've got the heavy artillery. So that kind of balances things out a little bit. Yeah, right now, both sides are pretty stalemated overall. There hasn't been a lot of changes in terms of territorial control. It was more dynamic earlier in the conflict, but it's kind of been settling down. You can still hear about territory changing hands. There's definitely, it's a more dynamic battlefield than in Ukraine, for example, which is heavily stalemated right now. But that said, it doesn't seem like anybody has the momentum in Sudan's civil war. So it's really hard to tell who's going to win, in other words.
Based on what you said about their genocidal campaign, I would assume that the RSF is the bad actor in this. It's not always, like, war is gross and evil in general, so it's hard to put people in the good guy, bad guy category. But one of the things that was relatively easy about the war in Ukraine is you had a sovereign nation that was just big chillin' where they were and they were attacked, so that makes that assessment relatively easy. But for situations like Israel-Palestine, it's already more muddy because those peoples have historically lived there for thousands of years, so it's really hard to say who gets what and where. And there's been lots of violence on both sides, so both sides have reason to lash out at the other. For this conflict, do the people have a spiritual leaning or an ideological leaning toward one side? Who do they want to win?
Probably the army. I mean, if you're an Arab living in Darfur, you probably prefer the RSF because they basically are your people. You may even be related to a number of them. But in like Khartoum, probably the army for the most part. It's not really an ideological civil war. For the most part, people do not prefer the army or the RSF because they prefer whatever vision they have for the future. Really, neither of them has a vision for the future. Both of them just want to continue the pre-existing regime, which was authoritarian and did not really give a shit about the public. The preference for one or the other largely just comes down to personal benefit, right? So if you're living in Darfur and you actually have relatives fighting in the RSF, it makes sense for you to support the RSF because if they win, they're probably going to accrue benefits that they share with you. On the other hand, if you're living in the rest of the country, you probably prefer the army because the army is paid. It's paid a salary. Whereas the RSF is basically paid in the form of loot. So when the RSF moves into a territory that they're conquering, they loot it, they rape, they steal, they kill, whatever, kidnap people, hold them for ransom, and that's how they get paid for the most part. The RSF does not have a lot of funding. Again, it's basically just a militia of country boys.
Basically pirate shit.
Yeah, gotcha. Pirate shit. That's one way of putting it. So, people don't like being robbed, raped, tortured, and killed. So the RSF is not very popular in much of the country correspondingly.
We have a viewer from Israel chiming in. They say they find it weird that Western people consider Israel and Hamas morally equal. I would say that's not the case for me. Israel is an organized government that does a lot for its people, and the military is a lot more disciplined and structured, and their military operations are a lot more professional versus the terrorism tactics of Hamas. So if we're looking at the organizations, the Israeli government and their military are relatively a lot more orderly and out for the long-term better interest, at least in terms of how they go about stuff. But one thing that's happened to a lot of people that I've heard, and I've even seen it in the chat during these discussions, is a lot of people get served very heavy propaganda to pick a side. And there are a lot of people who are basically focusing on the historical oppression of Palestinian people, and they're advocating for more stuff for them to be happy and live well, which I feel like that sentiment makes sense. One thing that we don't have that you as an Israeli citizen might have is the memories of, like we talked about earlier, the first and second intifada. I guess it was the second intifada that was the really nasty one.
Yeah.
But that would be horrific, and that would cause you to have a very like cautious view of whatever organization is controlling Hamas because of how violently they've treated you. So I feel for you. We try to be as unbiased as we can in these discussions, but obviously our perspectives are not complete, and we're just people from the United States, the two of us talking. So if we get anything wrong, or if we're reporting something incorrectly, or we miss something out, feel free to correct us in the chat. We're not here to tell you how to think. We're just trying to lay out the facts so you can think about it for yourself.
Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. This is a good time for it. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, more painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback we get from chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would argue here that, definitely Israel and Hamas are not like moral equivalents. Like Hamas is very explicitly a terrorist organization. They don't hide it either. They're quite open about it. Like they very much see violence as the only viable. Hamas very much sees violence as the only viable pathway to victory or progress or any kind of change in the status quo whatsoever. So no, I would not equate Israel with Hamas, certainly. If you want to find an equivalent to Hamas in Israel, you could argue that there are such actors, maybe some of the more radical settler parties. They don't really commit terrorism per se, but they, and their voters more specifically, have been known to commit acts of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And they do come from a political lineage in Israel's political history that does have its roots in terrorism. There are groups like the Stern Gang, and there was another one too. I think Levi. Can't remember how to pronounce it. But there have been far-right terrorist groups in Israel. Mostly, they were active before Israel's independence. I think the height of their activity was late 1930s and then 1940s. But the political ideologies and perspectives that those groups held continue to exist in Israel's politics. Their descendants, who continue to have similar perspectives, are not as violent. They don't blow shit up or perpetrate car bombings or what have you. But it's not hard to see that they would if they could or if they thought it necessary. So there's a difference between, willingness and ability. They have the will, probably, but they don't really have the ability, given that Israel has a liberal democracy that does not tolerate that degree of violence. Mm-hmm. Palestine, whatever you can say about Palestine, you have to concede that they do not have functional, coherent political institutions like Israel does. And part of one of the implications of that is that it's much harder for any one force, one party or government or what have you, to have a monopoly on violence in Palestine. So, if there are spoilers that want to kill people or otherwise undermine the peace process, it's much easier for spoilers in Palestine to do that. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that those spoilers do not exist in Israel. They do, very much. They very much do. Likud itself has more than a few. So, don't confuse quality political institutions with a lack of desire for violence. If Israel were less functional politically, its politics and its violence, for that matter, would probably look similar to that which you see in Palestine.
Yeah, people need some form of leadership, and that leadership can be more or less violent depending on the situation. In this case, we've talked about this a while, but there have been people who ask about the Israel and Palestine conflict really since we started World Discussion with Agent Smith. It's not even a relatively new topic for us, and the answer that you give sometimes, which is so great, is when they ask, what are your thoughts on the Israel-Palestine conflict? How far back do you want to go? Because we could go back to Bible times, or we could go to the mid-1900s, or wherever you like.
Yeah, there's plenty of violence to study.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of grievances. If you want to do the grievance Olympics with Israel Palestine, you're going to be very busy for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. So I think, did I ask you about Yemen yet? Someone asked about an update on that.
Yeah,
conflict.
you did.
Gotcha.
I didn't have anything to report, really. There's been no change that I'm aware of.
Hmm.
So is there any other drama that Chad was interested in?
Yeah, there's some 14th Amendment in Colorado, and people are asking what that means for Trump, but I don't know what that amendment
I
is.
think that was. I'm still not entirely sure what the 14th Amendment has to do with it, but it had to do with a lawsuit that was brought in order to prevent Donald Trump's name from being listed on the ballot for the 2024 election in Colorado, specifically. And the reasoning was that Donald Trump had participated in an insurrection against the government, and that the relevant laws on the books state that anyone who does so cannot sit in office as a public official. Such was the reasoning. And the judge's ruling was pretty interesting. He said that he basically conceded that there had been an insurrection, which I think is the first time I've seen a judge say as much. That's about as explicit an assertion that there was an insurrection and that Donald Trump was complicit in it as you're likely to see from a federal official. But his caveat was that the relevant law in question did not pertain to presidents. His argument was that if the writers of the law had intended for the law to apply to presidents and presidential candidates, they would have said so. As is, the wording is somewhat ambiguous and is generally interpreted, or at least this judge is interpreting it, to refer only to lower level public officials. So it wasn't a lawsuit per se, but the suit was struck down. Basically, they lost, and Donald Trump will be on the ballot come 2024 in Colorado.
Gotcha.
And it's likely that that ruling will have implications for similar ongoing court cases in other battleground states. Basically, in every battleground state you can think of, Democrats are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to argue that he's an insurrectionist and he should be stricken from the ballot. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I would say his fans are too enthusiastic to really allow that to happen. And also, you do have to really, I think a lot of what Trump has done has really tested the rules versus the norms, and how he's broken a ton of norms, but the hard and fast rules he hasn't broken as many of, because we do give the president a lot of leeway in doing stuff in the United States, just for the purpose of, if during wartime this happens, you want to make sure they have some leeway. And many other presidents that we've had, probably almost all of them, haven't really tested those boundaries before. So it's a interesting drama to watch play out. Some people are more excited about it than others.
Yeah, it's likely to be pretty divisive, I imagine. But I think the overall implications are not significant. They tried to get him off the ballot, it failed, so they'll move on to whatever the next, bullshit tactic will be. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to 2024.
Yeah.
The politics are going to be dumb.
Yeah.
So buckle up for that.
Chat's saying that Trump is being found guilty of 90 plus charges. That's a civil case, right? I can't remember what that is. He's in a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that one has to do with misreporting the value of his properties, I believe. So they had Ivanka Trump, and they had his accountants and the accountant agency up on stand, and they were kind of trying to pin them down on whether or not the valuation of his properties was accurate, or if they had been misrepresented in an effort to gain a loan from a bank. And apparently Donald Trump's legal strategy for that trial has been to just be belligerent There hasn't really been much attempt to actually like defend his record on this count. From the legal commentary I was reading, like it seems pretty clear he's guilty and that he doesn't have a very strong case.
So what does he do?
seems,
He just like yells about different stuff and is dramatic?
Well, I can give you, well, yes, that too, but but I can give you a more specific example. His lawyers, during one particular day in court, started arguing that the judge's clerk was biased against their clients and that they should be recused from the trial. And that was non sequitur because, you know, the clerk doesn't have anything to do with the trial. They don't weigh on the outcome, etc. And the judge actually got very aggravated with them because they kept going back and forth on this for like an hour at one point. And even after that, they kept bringing it up.
That clerk gave me the side eye. That's not relevant to this case at all. You didn't see how the clerk looked at me. That poor clerk getting so much attention.
That's not too far from the truth, quite frankly, because they really didn't have anything substantive as far as evidence of bias against him in any case. And the judge eventually just explicitly told them, look, if you bring this up again, you're going to be sanctioned. I'm going to do something to you. So that's been about the amount, that's been pretty much the substance of his defense. Just obfuscate and be a clown and otherwise just well, I mean, really, he's just trying to get attention. Like, he's trying to make this into a circus so he can get his name in the news again. Because realistically, he's probably not going to win, right? So, if nothing else...
We said that last time he won, so let's be careful.
Well, true. But in this case, anyway, it seems likely that he's going to lose. And, you know, if that's the case, he might as well try to make the best of a bad situation from his perspective.
Is he still relatively ahead of the other Republican people, or?
No, he's not.
He's not?
Way ahead of them.
Oh, he's way ahead.
He's like 20 points ahead of the next guy.
Oh, you just don't think that he can win the election against the Democratic person, which is probably going to be Biden?
Oh, Biden? I'm talking about the Republican primary.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's way ahead of like all of the other contestants there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ron DeSantis really kind of shit the bed because he was ahead of Trump for a while at one point. And then it just his campaign just died. It was one of the wilder collapses I've seen.
What happened?
He's just not very charismatic, quite frankly. It just doesn't seem like he has good political instincts. Probably doesn't help that people have been making fun of him on Twitter like near constantly. He's an easy guy to make fun of. He makes like these weird faces and statements and just it feels like he's forcing it, honestly. Like he doesn't have sort of he doesn't have the kind of natural acumen for public speaking and interacting with the public that, say, Donald Trump or other more charismatic politicians have.
It's so weird to me to think about Donald Trump as being charismatic, but for certain people he is. Yeah. For me, it's like listening to the word salad. It just hurts my brain whenever you don't finish a thought coherently and then you just ramble into the next one. But the thing is, a lot of people, when they speak normally in conversation, they do ramble and randomly change topics. So given that kind of expectation, he does talk normal-ish.
Yeah.
But it hurts my brain and soul.
Yeah, he knows how to channel his inner drunk uncle.
Yeah.
He can let it all out. It's quite familiar to many people, I'm sure. Yeah, to be fair, charisma often manifests in pretty much the same way. You know, I mean, there have always been loudmouths in American politics of all varieties. And, you know, we generally think of our preferred loudmouth as being the good option, right? He's a real one. He's honest. If everybody supported them, the country would be much, much better. But we think of them as like that because we don't see them as a loudmouth. We see them as just an honest broker. But people who disagree with your politics will look at that same person and say, I can't believe people find that guy charismatic.
Yeah, I guess it's like for the respective demographic, they could be charismatic or not. Kind of depends on the target audience. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean Donald. I mean, there's really no equivalent to Donald Trump in American politics, but political firebrands, as you might call them, are not uncommon at all. There's lots of people like that, and while we disagree with their politics very frequently, um, we do not think of them as a result as charismatic. Their supporters do think of them as charismatic. They very much enjoy the way that they talk about political issues and the passion that they pretend to bring. It's all pretty much just acting, but a lot of the voting public doesn't know that. So they see it as passion and they love it. Yeah, it's a kind of Hollywood fake charisma for a lot of politicians. Again, nobody's quite like Trump. Like I can't prove it, but I really suspect Donald Trump is just riffing at this point. If he wasn't already, if he just wasn't always just stream of consciousness telling people shit that he's always thought, just without a filter, and it just happened to work. Because that's pretty much what he's always done, right? He's not really that different than he was like 20 years ago or 10 years ago. If you look at the last time he ran for president unsuccessfully before 2016, he pretty much was running the same campaign.
Yeah.
It wasn't that different.
Yeah, you make a bully archetype for all of your opponents and disparage them to the point that other voters figure that, well, I can't vote for that person because of how negative they are. And you have this rambling stream of consciousness guy who's like he's posing as the outsider candidate. And I feel like posing as an outsider candidate is very strong right now, seeing the Argentina win as well. Because a lot of people are generally dissatisfied with normal standard governance in some ways. Not everyone, but some people are.
Yeah.
For me as someone, and this is like full disclosure, I'm not like a complete centrist. I am relatively more left-leaning when it comes to how I tend to vote. It's not as though Biden is an exciting option either. Like he's like the vanilla choice, where it's the most normal, regular, similar to other administrations that didn't mess up too bad. But it's not as though he's particularly charismatic. He represents the stability vote, and Trump represents the instability vote, which some people do want dramatic change, so it makes sense.
Yeah, Donald Trump is more of a constant variable that just kind of finally found its way. He didn't change anything, but the world did change. And when it did, he was able to find an opening. Yeah, I would not describe him as like a mastermind that looked at the world as it was and adjusted correspondingly and adapted a campaign platform that was victorious. Like, I think that's giving him way too much credit. The rest of the political establishment was thoroughly discredited, and there was an opening for an outsider candidate, and there he was. Just the wrong man at the right time.
Yeah. Some people really like him, though, and he's retained many fans over the years.
A lot of people really liked Caligula, too. I'm sure he had his fans.
Yeah.
Didn't mean he was a good leader.
Stay safe, chat, when people try to persuade you. Chat was talking a little bit about cults and stuff before we got started, and how that's an interesting area of marketing as well, where people will try to rope you into something and take your money, and they'll promise you the things that everyone kind of wants to an extent. Like, a lot of people have pain and trauma, so any cult that's promising renewal and improvement and change and that kind of stuff is going to seem very attractive, and you'll feel like these people have your best interest at heart because they're talking about real stuff that's an actual issue for people and that kind of a thing. So healthy attitude of skepticism can be really big, so you don't get duped and all your money taken away.
Yeah, that's always good advice.
Scientology is such a funny one because we saw a science fiction author basically make up the religion after writing a whole bunch of books about sci-fi, and it's very similar to a lot of the sci-fi themes and that sort of deal.
Yeah, didn't he write a book or something about religion at one point? Like, just how fake and artificial it was?
He made a joke about he could do it too, like he could just make a religion, and then he did so.
Yeah,
I've
I've always been pretty suspicious on that count.
Yeah.
Yeah, methinks somebody was doing a little trolling.
Yeah, but then if you troll and you realize you can make obscene amounts of money doing it, then like doubling down can be a business decision.
Yeah, if it had not denigrated into a sort of pseudo authoritarian cult, I could almost respect it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yeah. People aren't really taught skepticism and defenses to these offers and persuasion attempts, though, in school. I didn't take a class on skepticism until I switched into a cognitive science degree. There was actually a skepticism course, and it was based on all the different cognitive biases we have, like credulity, that naturally predispose us to trust what other people have to say, just out of a survival need. If someone says, "Oh my gosh, there are 3 bears out there, and we need to run right now," the people who said, "Are there though? I don't really believe you," they were eaten by bears, never to be seen again. So that's why people naturally, whenever someone's like, "Hey, I have a really good offer for you," you kind of think that, well, maybe they do. Like, it's worth me checking this out and listening to it. But that opens the door for scam artists. So stay safe. Did you take a skepticism class, though? Exactly. That's exactly the energy we need more of. See, you're even skeptical of my claim.
There you go.
There was another question. People were asking about the current state of the semiconductor industry. We've talked about Taiwan a few times, and that's one of the areas where they tend to come up.
Yeah, it's kind of in a funky place right now. So you remember during the pandemic, there was a big shortage of semiconductors. And I mean, it wasn't a uniform shortage. It impacted certain areas more than others. It was more disruptive for the automotive industry, for example, and perhaps not as much for, say, the electronics industry. But in general, there was a shortage for a while. So they invested in manufacturing capacity, right? They upgraded their existing factories, they built new ones, etc. So they started making more. And then they raked in the money because inflation was high enough that they were able to produce more and take advantage of the higher prices without prices really falling too significantly. But over the past year or so, prices fell. Actually, it may have even started last year. I don't quite remember, but in general, the prices in the semiconductor industry have been falling, and now the industry is actually getting squeezed. Not because of supply restrictions, but just because they've been producing so much that the price is now getting depressed, and their profit margins are being squeezed as a result. So in terms of profitability, they're doing better than they were back during the pandemic when their supply chain was 6 kinds of fucked. But the downside is that they've pretty well corrected from that to the point where they're back where they started. Keep in mind, contrary to what people may think, profit margins in the semiconductor industry have actually historically been relatively narrow. That is to say, profits have not really been very high on a per unit basis. And that just comes down to the fact that it's basically just about mass production. Like, you really need to crank out as many semiconductors as you can. And it also has to do with the fact that the fixed capital, right, the capital investment you need to set up a semiconductor factory is quite high. Actually, they call them semiconductor fabs, not factories, but same thing, basically. Just the equipment you need to make semiconductors is really expensive, and you need to borrow a lot of money to get that. So they're getting squeezed at this point as a result of all that. It'll be fine, right? Because again, through the industry's history, they're used to that, and they're getting subsidies that they weren't getting before now too, from the United States, Europe. Everybody and their mother has an industrial policy now. I don't think too many of them are very good, but they do have them, and that is effectively free money to the semiconductor industry. So that'll help them a bit and kind of get them through the squeeze that they're in right now.
Gotcha. Well, cool. I wasn't sure if you would have a good answer on that one, but you had things to say. Hell yeah. It's like, I don't know how
Yeah, a
much he
little
knows
bit.
about semiconductors, but it is definitely something that a lot of different industries need to use. So
Oh yeah.
it's an ever increasing importance, this market.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous. The more digitalization happens in the broader economy, the more electronics you need, right? The Internet of Things, which is a
Mm-hmm.
terrible name for that idea, but it seems to be the one the industry has decided to go with. But just the idea that you can connect regular objects to the internet or some broader network, that's nice, but it also means that you're going to have to jam lots of computer chips into stuff that you didn't have to put chips in before. So you're going to need a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, yeah, you're pretty much everything has computer chips in it now. So semiconductors, as a result, are just ubiquitous everywhere. It's the cornerstone of the modern 21st century economy,
Mm-hmm.
which is why everybody and their mother is scrambling to try to secure the supply chain in order to ensure that there isn't some kind of cutoff that happens in the event of a conflict between the United States and China. The results of that disruption would be very significant, to put it mildly.
Cool. There was also. Oh, I was wondering if there's been an update on things that are happening in Burma.
Not really. I don't. I think the news that I talked about last week was the biggest news that had come out from Burma in a while. That big offensive in the border along the border with China. But
Mm-hmm.
other than that, there hasn't been any new news that I've seen. Yeah, it's a very underreported conflict. It's not really a proxy conflict per se, like what you would see in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And Burma itself is not all that important to the global economy. So
Mm-hmm.
there have not been like big economic repercussions that have resulted from the war.
Yeah, last week
So
we pulled up the map of it and looked at the topography of the country, and there's like
yeah,
the nice area in the center around the capital, but a lot of it is mountainous and dense forest, so it's not really high economic throughput.
uh, you saw the capital, Naypyidaw, in the middle of the country.
Mm-hmm.
That's new.
It's new.
Yeah, they just finished building that like maybe 10 years ago or so.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a port city in the south of Burma called, I guess it's called Yangon now. It used to be
Mm-hmm.
called Rangoon. I think they've changed the name of it. That used to be the capital. And it had been the capital for like 100 plus years, from British rule over the territory and then through up until like 10 years ago, it had been the capital of independent Burma. But the military decided that they wanted to build a new capital in the interior of the country that, well, supposedly the reason they gave, the rationalization they had, is they wanted a capital that was more secure. If your capital is a port city, then your capital is vulnerable to anybody that has a strong navy
Pirates.
or pirates, as the case may be. But if your capital is in the interior of the country, in the middle of the country, you have more strategic depth to work with. So that was the excuse they had. Probably it was more just an excuse to spend a lot of money on something they didn't actually need, so that they could steal it. The power elite and corrupt political systems invariably loves to spend on big projects, not because they want to do stuff or build anything, but because ubiquitous corruption means that they can invariably embezzle a significant chunk of the funds that are appropriated for projects like that. Case in point, you can look at Russia with Sochi during the Sochi Olympics back in, what was it, like 2014, I think. Was it 2014? It must have been 2014. I don't remember. Well, regardless, the Russian government built up a bunch of infrastructure in Sochi for the Sochi Olympics, but the quality was not always there. The media kind of made fun of them unfairly. It wasn't as bad as the media made it out to be. But everybody kind of knew that there was a lot of money being stolen. Like it was sort of just common knowledge. And you could see quality issues pop up here and again on account of it. So, big projects invariably are opportunities to get rich and steal money. Obviously, they steal money before big projects. They don't really need it as an excuse. They kind of do that routinely, but you can steal even more money if you have a big project with which to justify appropriating large sums of money that can often be dispersed with lack of oversight, with predictable results.
Yeah, makes sense. I need this many billions of dollars for this project. Let me just pocket a third of that for myself and then use the rest to do the project.
Well, yes. More specifically, though, if you want to know the details, the actual mechanisms by which they do it, a lot of it is kickbacks. So what they'll do is that they'll say, okay, well, we're going to give a tender for a project that we want to do. Send in your bids. Oh, by the way, whoever offers me the biggest kickback is going to win, regardless of how good your bid is.
Mm-hmm.
They don't say that out loud, but it's kind of understood.
Mm-hmm.
And they do negotiate that. So invariably, the people responsible for administrating the project are connected to the power elite, the president or the government, whatever. And they'll tacitly create an alliance, if you like, with whatever powerful private interest is able to win the bid by way of those kickbacks. And generally, there will be repeat business as well. There will be kind of an understanding that the government will provide further business so long as the company continues to provide kickbacks. Yeah, sometimes those relationships last long enough for there to be intermarriage between the people who run the private sector entities and the government power elite. And at that point, the private sector company kind of de facto becomes an extension of the government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in authoritarian political systems, your personal network, especially family, but also just friends and people who have helped you in the past, or people who you helped in the past, or who are otherwise friends, that is really the foundation for any power elite in an authoritarian system. They lean very heavily on that trust, but trust is very hard to come by in a political system where, betraying people, murdering people, sending them to the gulag is a viable political tactic.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be very careful with who you trust in a system like that. So the result is that people in power in especially developing countries, but as more broadly just authoritarian countries in general, they tend to be very clubby. They tend to have very small cliques that run together and lean on each other for favors.
When you said clubby, I thought two things that were not that, which was they like to go to like party clubs, or they like to hit people with clubs, which that one seems like it kind of fits.
Yeah, they do commit acts of violence. That is part and parcel of the game.
Mm-hmm.
I think local elites in the Philippines are particularly known for that. Some of the old school landowners who are still powerful in the local areas will actually straight up murder people who run against them in elections.
Jeez.
Yeah, there's not inconsiderable violence in the Philippines during elections. It doesn't get reported on a lot in international media because the Philippines is not really of interest internationally. Like, it doesn't get much attention. But if you actually pay attention to the Philippines news, there's quite a bit of drama that happens there during elections.
Mm-hmm.
An unfortunate reality in Filipino democracy. We're doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got about another 45 minutes.
Gotcha. Well, let's see. Was there anything else that you kind of wanted to get to, or people were asking about?
I think those were all the ones that I wrote down before we got started.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we did have some comments, so maybe we could look at those.
Sure.
So thank you, Fuzzy Cord. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for posting the questions. Yes, that is very amusing. I do appreciate the humor. Yeah, that's a globalized society for you. So it goes. Let's see. I also have a question. Oh, wait. Okay. There was one about money. Did I see that?
Oh, yeah. People were asking why the U.S. has been printing so much money over the last few years.
Yeah, I think that's what this is. I also have a question regarding the US money supply. To what extent is the recent inflation simply a consequence of pandemic stimulus money increasing the money supply? Yeah, so that's a debate in economics right now, and you're not likely to get a clear cut answer, probably for another like 5 to 10 years or something. I don't think overall that inflation really can be attributed. Well, I guess there's a difference between inflation in 2021 and inflation in 2023, right? During the pandemic and in 2021, you had different factors at play. The pandemic was obviously taking a heavy toll, as well as all the lockdowns. So that was creating significant supply side inflation, or supply push inflation, as the economists would say. But then in 2021, you had a lot of demand pull inflation. You had a big surge in inflation as the economy bounced back. Actually, that started in late 2020, but 2021 is really when the economic recovery took off. But the supply side restraints had not really fully resolved yet. So you had lots of demand surging at the same time that suppliers were having difficulty meeting it. So no shock that inflation resulted out of that. That should have been predictable. But to what degree can we ascribe that inflation to the pandemic relief funds? That's a little trickier. And keep in mind, it wasn't just the pandemic relief funds. Well, I think you actually said that, didn't you? The concept of pandemic stimulus. Okay, that's a little different. So pandemic stimulus money, I'm going to assume here refers more to like the PPP type stuff, like the fiscal stimulus. Keep in mind, there was also the monetary stimulus, like the Federal Reserve just like went apeshit and mag dumped money onto the economy during the pandemic, especially in 2020. There was a very real fear that financial markets would just freeze up and collapse. And so the Federal Reserve came out and said, we are going to give the financial markets in the United States as much money in the form of quantitative easing as we think is needed in order to ensure that their operations continue uninterrupted. And, there's trade-offs there. I mean, obviously, there's significant moral hazard. There probably should have been more losses than there were. And it resulted in the bizarre circumstance of Wall Street, that is to say, financial markets, stock exchanges doing very well in late 2020, despite the economy basically just grinding into shit because of all the lockdowns. So a very significant disparity there that was not lost on certainly people concerned about inequality in the United States. But keep in mind, to bring this full circle, to keep in mind that monetary easing, monetary policy and fiscal policy were at play. And given that both of them were expansionist in nature, that is to say that they were both stimulating the economy, it's really hard to pick apart the effects. That is to say, it's really hard to distinguish between their effects. There's such a thing as what are called simultaneity effects, where two factors are impacting a third factor at the same time. So given regression analysis and other methodological tools that are used in order to study causal effects, it's very difficult, basically impossible, to apply that toolkit to simultaneity effects, because you do need a clear cut, or at least something resembling a clear cut order of causality between effects in order to distinguish between different effects. But with simultaneity effects, it's very hard. Well, all right, it's hard for that to happen. I should say simultaneity effects are actually two-way. That's what I meant. Simultaneity effects are where variables affect other variables at the same time as that other variable is impacting them. So I'm getting crossing my wires a little bit here. But the fundamental assertion remains the same. It's hard to distinguish the impact of monetary policy from that of fiscal policy when they're both going full throttle at the same time. So to what degree can we say that inflation in 2021 is the result of one or the other? I don't know. It's very difficult to say, and people are going to argue about that for a long time, most likely. I would argue, given the evidence that I've seen, that it was not as significant as the demand surge and the supply constraints. but I could easily be wrong on that. But that's 2021. What about now? Like, what about inflation in 2023? So inflation in 2023 is different because it's not as broad-based as inflation was in 2021. Core inflation right now has cooled considerably than previous years. And at this point, it's mostly being driven by housing, from the data I've seen anyway. So housing takes a long time to shift gears. It's basically, of the different price categories, it's basically like the super tanker. It takes a long time to change it, to change the trajectory of inflation in the housing sector. But it has been changing. It has been trending somewhat downwards. But other sources of inflation that had been driving it earlier are not really there. The supply constraints have opened up considerably. They've basically been dealt with. There is still fairly robust demand, but it's not surging like it was earlier. Late 2020 and through 2021, you saw like big jumps in demand. Now you don't see that so much. Now the commentary is not about it increasing so much as the fact that it's not decreasing. Whenever you see commentators point out that demand in the United States is robust, that's basically them saying that demand has continued to remain fairly steady despite the fact that there are a bunch of headwinds facing the economy, not least of which is the interest rate hikes that happened in late 21 and then through 2022.
Do you think it's because Americans are demanding people?
No, I don't think it's because Americans are demanding people. I think part of it is because some industries have not finished recovering from the pandemic. So like hospitality and recreation, industries related to that, like tourism, travel, etc. Those industries are actually still adding jobs at a pretty fair clip. And it's actually kind of above trend, to the point where I suspect that the fast rate of job creation in the industry is reflective of the fact that it's still kind of getting back to where it was before the pandemic. So that's resulted in a significant number of jobs added that are above and beyond what you would expect given the amount of output growth, that is to say GDP growth, that the United States has been reporting in its data. And, those jobs are not very good jobs. They generally don't pay very well. But in terms of just aggregate demand, if you add a whole bunch of shit jobs that have even just minimal wage, the overall amount of demand is increasing in the data. Your quality of life is not necessarily great if you work in those jobs, but you are buying more stuff than you would be buying if you were just unemployed. So that's kind of where the economy is. There is some strength in the economy. There are strong sectors adding good jobs, especially more in like tech and stuff. But those are not necessarily like the biggest drivers of employment gains. When people talk about employment and demand being robust, it seems to be more hospitality and to a lesser degree healthcare that seems to be driving that. And that seems set to continue. Now, again, it's not growing a lot. It's just not falling, which is what you would expect with interest rates hiked as much as they are. And with the overall, global economic environment as uncertain as it is, and with China continuing to experience economic difficulties, you would think that there would be maybe at least a mild recession right now. But it hasn't really happened. Overall employment has been robust enough to support consistent, if not rapid growth in economic demand. And inflation kind of reflects that, right? Inflation is pretty moderate across the board, except for like one or two key categories. And it's still not as low as the Fed would like it. Like overall inflation is still elevated, even amongst core inflation categories. But the trend is downward. So the trend is healthy, and the Fed kind of likes that. That's part of the reason why they started suspending rate hikes recently. They were thinking about doing it in the last quarter, but they ultimately decided not to. And they might do something similar the next time as well. But housing is the issue, I think. And in so much as that's the case, I don't think that the pandemic stimulus money is really responsible for that. A lot more of the change, the inflation in the housing sector, has more to do with that demand surge in 21. keep in mind that price changes in the housing market are lagged. Lagged is the appropriate term here. So changes in the housing market at a given point in time actually more reflect changes in the overall economy that happened in a previous time period, generally several months, if not years, before the change in price. Part of that just has to do with rent and leases. When you sign a lease, or to a lesser degree when you sign a mortgage, price changes don't change. You're kind of locking in that price for a significant period of time. And so as a result, you don't really enjoy, changes. You don't really have the opportunity to change your price or to change apartment in order to take advantage of a different price, as much as you would with, say, a different kind of good. If you want a cheaper apple, you can go to a different store. But if you want a cheaper lease, well, you either have to buy out the lease you have, or just have to wait for it to expire. So that inherently means that price changes in the market for housing are much slower than in the rest of the economy. So that demand surge in 21, which resulted in a lot of people moving out of apartments, trying to find houses, a lot of people in the middle of their career trying to move to suburbs and start kind of anew there. All of that stuff normally happens, but it was all just concentrated in 2021 because of the circumstances of the pandemic and the recovery to the pandemic. And so that supercharged demand for housing and created a big upsurge in both construction and prices. And the market has not really corrected for that yet. We're still responding to that. So the stimulus money did have some impact, but the amount of money that was given to like the average person was not that much. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, that money was maybe enough to pay for a month of rent, which is not really enough to move the needle on the housing market writ large. And again, given that it's the housing market that seems to be one of the main, if not the main, culprits for inflation in 2023, I would not therefore infer, rather, that the pandemic stimulus money can be blamed for current inflation. I guess I'm assuming here that when you talk about money supply, you're talking about inflation. Certainly, if you want to talk more specifically about money supply, certainly quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve significantly increased the money supply. That was very much by design. So yeah, definitely that's true. If you're referring to the fiscal side of things with regard to pandemic stimulus money, not so much. Fiscal policy does have the power to stimulate the economy, but it doesn't really increase the supply of money per se. That statement is going to infuriate proponents of modern monetary theory, but I don't think that theory holds a lot of water. I kind of think it's bullshit. So I don't think, therefore, that fiscal policy really significantly impacts money supply. I guess there's some macroeconomists that would not like that either. So, fight me. I don't think they're right on that. And there's room for criticism and debate there, certainly. But yeah, overall, monetary policy is the main vector through which policymakers influence money supply, and they definitely significantly increase money supply in response to the pandemic. So if that's what you're asking, then yeah, absolutely. But otherwise, not so much. Just kind of depends on what the questioner kind of meant there by pandemic stimulus money. Well, that's all we had for questions.
Nice. If we have any other follow-up ones from chat, feel free to let us know.
I think I did have a correction from last week. I think last week I was talking about Ariel Sharon and how he undermined, if not deliberately sabotaged, peace talks in the late 90s by visiting a holy site in Jerusalem. I said that I thought it was the Wailing Wall, but somebody in chat corrected me and said that it was the Al-Aqsa compound, not the Wailing Wall that he visited. So thank you for the correction. Yeah, that's a very controversial compound. The Israelis think that the Temple Mount's foundation is underneath it. Mm-hmm. or more accurately, is underneath one particular part of it, more specifically. So the suspicion amongst Islamists is that Jewish fundamentalists want to tear down the Al-Aqsa compound, possibly just the one section over the Temple Mount, but maybe the entire compound, and replace it with a reconstructed Jewish temple over the site. And of course, Islamists don't want that. The Al-Aqsa compound is, I believe, the third holiest site in Islam. Certainly one of the holiest sites in Islam. So it ranks up there. The Islamic community, and especially Islamic fundamentalists, are not going to appreciate an effort like that. And given how suspicious they are of the Israeli government and certainly the intentions of groups like Likud, their paranoia is quite high whenever anything happens that even remotely suggests that a group like Likud or other fundamentalists in Israel might be thinking about tearing down the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Ariel Sharon visiting the Al-Aqsa compound was not necessarily a big deal in and of itself. The bigger deal was the potential implications. That's really what set off the Islamic community, and more specifically the Palestinian community in the West Bank.
It's our third holiest site. Oh yeah? Well, it's our second holiest site. Now what will you do?
Fight over it for 100 years, apparently.
Why stop there? Why not 150? Yeah, jokes aside, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
People could just like enjoy a holy site together. That would be really chill.
Yeah, they could, but that would require a degree of emotional intelligence that radicals on either side lack.
Yeah.
If they did have it, they wouldn't be radicals, most likely.
I had a college professor that did a pretty good job of at least hammering home one point that they felt like people didn't innately understand as students entering their class, and their whole bag was humans are more similar to each other than they are different from each other. And they really wanted to make that like the entire take home of the whole course. Whether you remember any detail about any particular psychologist or not, they didn't care. It was that they wanted you to really consider the amount of similarities, just the raw number of side by side, this is the exact same for this human here and that human there, and how we really divide ourselves by putting ourselves into these strong categories, and we don't really think about the context of how those categories came to be. One of them that's a fun one from a religious standpoint is the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith are both Abrahamic religions in that they share the same religious heritage. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. That's a song that we learned in Sunday school. And Abraham was a dude, old dude in the Bible from a long, long time ago. And apparently had a bunch of children, and they went in different directions. And many of the religious teachings that were part of the Jewish Bible ended up being part of the Christian Bible, and then also referenced in the Quran. I'm not an expert in the Quran. I haven't read it, so correct me if I'm wrong about that. But I think that there are biblical figures from Jewish and Christian teaching in the Quran, which makes it really confusing to me that you would be that angry toward demographics that are very much linked to your own and have a lot of commonalities between them. It's not as though it's like Buddhists fighting them who are coming from a very different spiritual trajectory. This is from the same spiritual trajectory, which maybe that's why they're so mad, is because it's pretty adjacent in terms of ideology. But yeah, overall, humans, they need to work to survive. They need food and shelter. They like music and cuisine. They have their opinions and they hold them strongly. The sooner that we can realize that people have the same need set, I think the sooner we can figure out how to deliver that and respect other people's space and differences of opinion. Also acknowledging when you can't change someone's mind and accepting that. I think that's a pretty big thing that a lot of people can't really reconcile. I learned this whenever I went through my angry atheist phase. After announcing that I was no longer a Christian, I realized that while some people, especially younger people, you could maybe attempt to persuade them out of their faith, anyone who was say, over 40, it seemed like they were too committed to it just because of how long they had believed in it. And they had lots of life experience that reaffirmed their beliefs. So, in that sense, you do need people from within that faith system to help de-radicalize. I saw a documentary. It was actually a Canadian-based one on groups of Muslims in Canada who help de-radicalize Muslims who are like trying to be offered to join ISIS or the Taliban or something like that. Because there are propaganda pieces that are put online that say, if you actually care about this ideology, you should go fight here. That's propaganda to try to get more soldiers for them. How do you reason with this person? You can't go to them and say, your religion is wrong. You're just going to show up as a villain and an opponent. You basically need a moderate, peaceful person of that same belief system to basically point to different peaceful parts of the ideology to calm them down and to get them to not do that. So Muslims are definitely instrumental in helping us figure out ways to find peace in this conflict. Same thing with Jewish people. Whatever your religious and cultural background is, for you to be able to find the reasons for peace within your belief system is really big, especially since you can't change everyone's mind on a dime. You have to kind of pick your issue and you have to pick your angle for persuading them.
Well said.
I went through a phase where I would go to church with my parents and I actually would like get the full script of what the pastor said, and I would put it into a like word count reader, and I would look at the counts of different kinds of words just to get the overall tone of the message, what it was about, any particular biases or leaning in it. I was very like trying to computationally break down a Christian sermon and how it works. And it ended up giving me some appreciation of it in a secular capacity of this is a time that a lot of people value to reflect upon their life, to find support from other people who are also trying to talk about just general life struggles. And religion does give people a rubric to navigate all of that space. Obviously, not everyone believes that that's a good thing, but some people do find good things through their religion. So the sooner we can admit that, I feel like the sooner we can tolerate and abide each other, rather than just hard lines say this religion can't exist on the planet. You can be a well-adjusted member of pretty much every religion, at least that I've heard of. But some are certainly more peaceful leaning than others. You've mentioned there have been a few cases of radical Buddhists, which is relatively rare, but it has happened, where they end up getting violent, even though it's traditionally seen as a very peaceful belief system.
Yeah, there's been a number of cases like that. Sri Lanka is probably the main one. To a lesser degree, Burma. I kind of suspect in Burma's case, it was just radicals being propped up by the government as an excuse to try to make Aung Suu Kyi look bad. But there were some radical Buddhists there. And Japan apparently has a history of them. Apparently they did have like some Buddhist warrior monks who were known for being good fighters and were often employed in wars of one sort or another. And it's something I was reading about more recently.
Yeah,
they are out there. Not everybody really gets the message, the core message of Buddhism quite right. Yeah, whenever I see them, I kind of just think to myself, I don't think they're doing it right. I'm no expert on Buddhism, but I don't think that calls to violence are really in keeping with the core tenets of the faith.
Yeah, usually they feel, or they're kind of harangued in as a necessary force of retribution sometimes. Like I'm thinking about the Christian examples of that, because Christianity, I feel like Christianity is still my sports team in the sense of that's what I was raised with. So I have like a culturally Christian worldview, but the Crusades was an example of when a lot of Christians were roped into acts of violence and conquest in the name of religion and they were given a lot of reasons why it was a good idea for them to do. Looking back on it, it's a heavily questionable and negative period where it was basically like church sanctioned piracy, kind of like you're talking about. People were paid in loot and stuff. I would wager that it was similar in the sense of you can go fight in these lands and stuff, and you have the blessing of the church, but I doubt that they were all paid by the church.
Yeah, correct. I mean, in that medieval period in particular, paying soldiers mostly in the form of loot was the main form of payment. There was some salary provided, but it was generally very limited. It was generally too low to realistically attract anybody to fight for them. So generally, it was the expectation that there would be loot that got people to join up, even in spite of the low salary. Which is why if you failed to conquer a city and allow them to loot, they would generally kill you.
Yeah.
They would not be very happy.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, there aren't any stories in the Christian Bible of Jesus joining a group and killing people. So there wasn't an example in the faith that set precedent for this, at least in terms of the Christian doctrine.
Yeah, remember when I read that when the Christians seized Jerusalem, they kind of went apeshit a little bit.
Yeah.
Killed a whole bunch of people, including Christians in the city.
Yeah. That, I think, points to some of what you've talked about of the difference between a religious and an ethnic conflict, is you can't really look at someone and see their religion unless they have specific garments that are a part of that, like Sikhism. You can see, like, they have the ceremonial dagger or whatever, so you can tell. But yeah, if these people are Middle Eastern ethnically speaking and they don't look like the European Crusaders, you could just see them as, okay, these are the opponents, when they actually may practice the same faith as you and you're doing an atrocity. It's an atrocity anyway, but it's extra stupid.
Yeah, I think too, partly it has to do with framing. I mean, I don't know how many people really like this framing, but it's probably the most accurate one. We kind of think as the Crusades as a clash of civilizations, two groups fighting over Holy Land, two competing religions. But really, it was not so much as just a barbarian invasion. Because Europe at that point was not actually as civilized as the Middle East was. And the people that were going to fight in the Holy Land were not like the best and brightest for the most part of Europe. Like a lot of the soldiers that went to fight were, there were some who genuinely believed, who genuinely had faith that they were doing something for their religion and for God and etc. But most of them were people who were generally middle children or just the youngest children in their family because of primogeniture. Generally, the eldest son inherited most of the land, or the land would get split. Primogeniture is actually splitting the land. But in practice, generally, it was the oldest son that would inherit the property of the father, and generally, younger sons kind of had to find something else to do. And so a lot of those guys ended up becoming mercenaries, fighting for this, that, or the other army. And when the Holy Wars started up in the Crusades, that was a really great opportunity for them to do something besides die in poverty, which is what a lot of them were effectively destined to do. So no surprise in that sense that they had a lot of takers, but correspondingly, they were not like particularly well-disciplined folks. It's not like these were wealthy businessmen or whatever. A lot of them were just like lower tier nobility. Who were kind of used to getting away, sometimes literally with murder. They were very privileged in a sense. And so they would kind of go off and get rich quick, basically, was kind of more the mindset for a lot of them than fighting a war for God and Jesus and whatnot.
Yeah, it sounds similar to Viking raids when you break it down that way.
Yeah, they probably had a lot more in common with them than they did with sort of the idealized vision of crusaders as just Christian warriors.
Yeah, we have the Christian crusader knight as like a visual archetype that we think of, like they lived by a holy code and they rode in shining armor and fought for the Holy Land. And it's like that also included basically peasants that had enough shit to fight with that were trying to get lucky and find some gold shit and then go back home.
Yeah. And keep in mind too that the reaction in the Arab world, the Muslim world, kind of reflected that. For Europe, it was a big religious crusade. We're going to take back the Holy Land. But for the Middle East, it was kind of more of a what the fuck moment. Like, what is this? Like, where is this coming from? Just a bunch of assholes from Europe just start invading this one tiny piece of the broader Muslim world. And it wasn't considered that big a deal overall. Like, there was other shit going on, like, at the time in the Muslim world. And that was just one hotspot. And, the land was holy. It was important. It was considered important to defend it. But it was not like this massive strategic liability if they lost it either. It was kind of seen as inevitable that they would be able to take it back at some point, even if they lost it in the short term, which is effectively what ended up happening. So Saladin was able to make a big name for himself, being able to take it back. And by the way, when he took back Jerusalem, that is to say, when the Muslims took back Jerusalem, they did not massacre the population and loot the city in order to pay their army. They were actually very restrained. So again, that kind of illustrates the difference in the degree of civility by the respective combatants. The Crusaders were definitely like the dirtier, hairier bunch between the two combatants.
Chad is asking if the Crusades were in retaliation into attacks into Europe.
No, not to my knowledge. Maybe somebody more familiar with the history behind them, knows better. But my understanding is that that is not the case. It was not retaliation. It was more something instigated by religious leaders, effectively, and encouraged by nobility who wanted a excuse to kind of get rid of restive, younger nobility. Yeah, Europe was a wild place in the Middle Ages. It was not nearly as refined as it would be later. It was still it was not barbarian really, per se, but you could tell that it had recently been barbarian. Let me put it like that. It was kind of emerging from the barbarian period and emerging as a civilization in its own right. But it was a very young civilization. And broad swaths of Europe were still largely populated by very restive, rustic people. Much more so than the type of people who had populated the more urban parts of, say, the Roman Empire. And that's another point worth making, too. Urban civilization in Europe had not really yet fully recovered from the fall of Rome by that point. So, there were urban pockets here and there, but the degree of urban civilization and civility did not really return in large part until a bit later in Europe's history.
One of the coolest things, if you ever get the chance to see it, is the city of Bath in England. And it's a Roman-built city. So you have like your traditional British architecture that you're used to, and then there's just a fucking huge-ass Roman city there. And it has all the pillars and columns and their kind of aesthetic that they had for things. And it's interesting to think about that was an era where the Roman Empire was way more advanced, technologically speaking, and just in their infrastructure and architecture and all this kind of stuff. And they had a period where they ruled that land, and then they collapsed, and they have kind of the ruins of it that were then used for the city by British people.
Have you ever seen a movie called Kingdom of Heaven?
Yes, that one has I think it's, what's his name? Fucking Legolas. What's his name? People say I look like him all the time. I'm in the middle of a...
Orlando Bloom?
Yeah. He's in that.
Yeah, that was an interesting take on the Crusades.
Yeah. It's been forever since I've watched that. Thank you, chat.
Yeah, I need to rewatch it because I didn't really have sound while I was watching it the first time.
Oh?
I was in the somewhat unusual circumstances. I was watching it on a laptop with an Indian friend in his apartment, which had like 8 other Indian guys.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we had to keep the sound down low.
Mm-hmm.
So the picture quality was not great, and I couldn't hardly hear anything.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up sitting for like 2 hours trying to just piece together what bits of the plot I could based off of visual cues.
I've
So,
done
yeah, I
that
could
before whenever I get an airplane seat and the headphone jack doesn't work for mine. So I can
yeah.
watch the movie, but I can't listen to it. I think sometimes I'll put on like a aesthetically cool movie like Blade Runner 20 whatever year it is. That one looks really cool aesthetically, and the dialogue is pretty few and far between. So that's one I can put on. Ready Player One's another cool one if I don't have audio set up for it.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's not the best way to watch a movie.
No,
You're gonna miss some things.
but it is a way to watch a movie.
Yeah, so I would recommend that. I liked it as was. I imagine it's even better with audio. So I would give it a recommend.
Best enjoyed with sound.
Yeah, exactly.
2049, thank you. That's the Blade Runner one.
Let's see. I think we did have a couple new questions. Arab media is saying that politicians are completed. I think he means completely. Arab media is saying that politicians are completely siding with Israel against Hamas. Hamas still has hostages from international countries. Do you think that Western politicians should support Hamas instead of siding with Israel and other countries who had their people captured? Let me read that again. Saying that Holland completed. Well, there's no way that Western politicians are going to support Hamas. Like, full stop. It is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. They've committed terrorist acts. And, near as I can tell, they're fairly proud of the results of their terrorist attacks, if the October raid is any indication. So it would pretty well be political suicide for any politician in the West to just openly say, you know what, fuck Israel. We need to throw our weight behind Hamas. That's a no-go. There may even be legal repercussions for doing that, just because you can't openly support, financially, at least in the United States, if not also just rhetorically in Europe, actual recognized terrorist organizations. So that's not going to happen. I don't think in any case that the logic really holds. I don't think that say Thailand, I think there are a few Thai citizens that are being held by Hamas. I don't think Thailand would really benefit from trying to work directly with Hamas to get their hostages out. Because the problem is that Hamas is trying to leverage those hostages into gains, right? They want to trade them for stuff, specifically with Israel. And so what's going to happen is that if Thailand tries to establish contact with Hamas, the Hamas leadership is probably going to tell them that they need to put pressure on Israel to give them what they want if they want the hostages back. And that is the best thing that the Thai government could do to ensure the safe return of their hostages. So direct negotiations between Hamas and the actual governments of the countries which some of these hostages are from are not likely to happen at all. Hamas is going to try to put as much pressure on those countries to pressure Israel to give concessions as possible. So most likely the only hostages that are going to be extracted are hostages that are conceded in negotiations with the Israeli government and not with third-party actors. I was reading before we started that there are negotiations happening that are mediated, negotiations between Israel and Hamas that are being mediated by the United States and Qatar. So those negotiations are happening. But I don't think third-party governments like Thailand and others that have hostages held by Hamas right now are really participating significantly in those talks. At least that was not the impression I got from the article. So if I don't get the gist of your question, do feel free to ask, because I have misread questions before and just completely gotten the wrong idea about what was being asked. So I'm quite happy to return to a question if I'm just getting it wrong completely.
There was one that I was discussing with my girlfriend that was kind of similar to this one, which is how can someone send aid to Palestine? Which my guess at it was, if you are seeing a group of oppressed people, but they don't have good administration around them, you can't really be sure that the aid is actually going to get to them. So
Yeah.
if you wanted to get aid to a normal Palestinian citizen, how would you do so? Because I think you said that Hamas does technically rule the territory,
Yeah.
because like they were voted in.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, if you want to give aid to the Palestinian people, but you don't really trust Hamas not to just steal it, your options are pretty limited. You know, there are groups like the Red Cross and other nonprofit, non-government organizations, basically charities, that operate in Gaza and that have been trying to help people, but their operations have been significantly curtailed on account of the military operation that is ongoing in Gaza. So you could give money to them, and they won't be able to basically pass on any benefits from that donation in the short term. But you know, hypothetically, eventually the operation will end, and at that point, the charities will be able to resume operations, and they'll have your money or whatever it is you're donating on hand to help people. So you know that is useful. It doesn't necessarily help people right now, but it will help people eventually. And there is going to be a lot of need in Gaza once the conflict ends. So, you know, every little bit helps in that regard. I don't know that I would trust giving money. I don't know that I would give money directly to Hamas or the Hamas government. That's probably a bad idea. I don't even know if that's legal in many countries. So, you know, don't do that. The major charities are probably okay. Smaller charities are probably a little more questionable just because it's harder to kind of verify the veracity of their operations. You know, a lot of them tend to be newer and don't have very strong track records. So you know, you kind of take your fate in your own hands when you're dealing with a small charity, especially in a conflict like the one in Gaza right now. If you really want to be ambitious, you could basically pay somebody to directly fly something like food or other forms of aid into Gaza by drone and try to get them food that way, or other aid that they might need that way. I don't think that's happening on any significant scale, or you know, maybe even at all. But it is hypothetically possible. The IDF will not like it, but you could do it. If you could find like-minded people willing to try it, that is hypothetically possible. I think another thing that I have seen done, and I actually read about this in an article. There was a guy who had a friend in Gaza. You know, he was an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli even, and he had a sort of Muslim Palestinian friend who he had made in Gaza. He was a peacenik. He was basically protesting in favor of peace, and he met some like-minded folks in Gaza, and so they got to be friends online. So he found out his friend was really struggling because she lost her home and she was basically in a refugee camp, and they didn't have anything that they needed, like food, water, whatever. And so he actually sent her money digitally. I think Venmo or I don't know, some app like that. So if you can find individual people that you want to help in Gaza, you could actually just directly send them money. That is apparently a viable option, or at least is possible. Of course, the trouble there is how do you find people that you know are not like Hamas agents just posing as people who need money?
Yeah.
You know, there is a trust barrier there that you would have to surpass. But if you could find people like that, then you could just directly send them money. That is another option. But yeah, overall, the options are just limited. Like if you want to send a lot of aid and really help people in need right now in Gaza, you effectively can't. It is effectively blocked. I think even just the most the Israeli government has conceded at this point is that they agreed recently to allow, I believe it was 2 truckloads of fuel to come into Gaza. Something like per week or per month or something. I don't remember the increment of time, but that's the most that they've agreed. Everything else is still off the table for the most part. They're still maintaining an almost total blockade of the territory while the military operations are ongoing.
Yeah,
Let's see.
definitely
Go ahead.
a muddy situation there. Hard to know how to help looking at it from the outside.
Let's see. And the last question we had here was, would the West let Israel genocide Gaza to protect itself? Do you mean Israel protect itself or Israel protect the West? I'm going to interpret the question as Israel protecting itself. So would the West allow Israel to genocide Gaza to protect Israel, to protect itself? Um, yeah, kind of. That kind of depends. Do you mean that if Israel like committed full Holocaust-style genocide against the population of Gaza, would the West allow it? They would disagree with it. They would not allow it in the sense that they would approve of it. But I also don't know that they would necessarily go to war over it. I don't know that like the West is collectively that invested in the Israel-Palestine issue to actually intervene. That's not to say they don't care. Lots of people, obviously, in the West care about the issue and would be mortified if Israel went to that extreme. But I don't know if they would be so mortified as to actually want to directly intervene. There's lots of violence around the world right now, and even in spite of that fact, there seems to be a very low appetite for intervention, especially in the United States. And so that makes me more than a little bit pessimistic that any significant increase in violence, perhaps up to and including a genocidal level of violence, would necessarily be enough to instigate action, to catalyze action on the part of the West to actually use military action to stop it. Keep in mind, too, it's not as though Israel would not fight back in that case if there were an intervention. So that's an added deterrent. I think the bigger problem from Israel's perspective, it wouldn't really be Israel. It would basically be like Shas or one of the radical parties or something that would be doing it. But if they did actually commit genocide in Gaza, the bigger problem would be like Egypt or some of the other Arab states in the region. Like they would probably feel obligated, if only as a result of public pressure, to do something. I don't know if it would be substantive, but they would do something violent in retaliation. And I don't think the Israeli government, even if it was run by radicals that would want to commit genocide, would see that as a good trade-off. They made a lot of gains in terms of peace with neighbors over the course of the past 40 years. Genocide would most likely jeopardize that semi-permanently. And I don't think any short-term benefit or even long-term benefit that would accrue from getting rid of the Palestinian Gazans would justify the cost-benefit of alienating major Arab states, especially Egypt. So I don't think it's likely. And certainly I think to go back to the question, I don't know how much the West would do in response, but definitely the Arab world would do something in response. And that's probably the much more relevant question. That said, what about a lower level of genocide? What if it's not like just outright genocide, but more like technical legal genocide, which is more what's happening in like the West Bank, right? The slow incremental dispossession and expulsion of the people from a given territory with the intent to seize their land and force them to be subsumed into a neighboring culture and territory. That's a kind of legal genocide. Not legal in the sense that it's allowed, but the legal definition of genocide technically encompasses sort of indirect, implicit efforts to remove and eliminate some target ethnic group. So there's actually a stronger case that Israel's committing genocide in the West Bank right now than there is for Israel committing it in Gaza right now, because Gaza is probably just a short-term, again, counterterrorism operation. There's not really any there's no Israeli settlements in Gaza right now. There are settlements in the West Bank, and they are being propagated as part of a plan, an intention on the part of far-right parties in Israel to eventually take all of that land. They do want that. They themselves have admitted as much on the down low. Never openly, per se, certainly not in front of a Western international audience, but within domestic Israeli politics, they've all but openly admitted it. So that is the plan. But not so much in Gaza. But, if there were a lower threshold of genocide in Gaza, then the answer is definitely no. Definitely, I don't think that the West would see that as being substantive enough to warrant direct intervention. I'm talking in terms of direct intervention. I guess you could rephrase the question to refer more specifically to any response at all. There would definitely be a response. There would definitely be sanctions. There would definitely be opprobrium. There would definitely be efforts to isolate Israel on the international stage, economically, politically, etc. There would definitely be a backlash in that sense. I just don't think, given that how committed the Israeli far right is to taking the land, I don't think any of that stuff would actually stop them. I think if it came to that, if they actually did start committing genocide, the only thing that would stop them would be direct intervention, which is why that's what I started answering the question with. So, and I don't think anybody really wants to fight a war with Israel over Palestine, almost regardless of circumstances, other than the Arab world. Europe and the United States, we care enough to be angry about it and to sanction them over a potential genocide, but I don't know how much more would actually happen. Maybe that's just me being cynical, but just given where the politics are and given the severe, significant disinterest in foreign adventurism, I think there would be a great deal of difficulty generating actual forces from Europe or North America to actually carry out a mission to intervene in that way. The Arab world would have lots of volunteers. They would be very gung-ho. And again, I think that would be enough deterrence to prevent it from happening. That is to say, to prevent a genocide from happening. But yeah, I don't know that the West in general can be counted on to do much more than complain loudly.
Yeah. Speaking out against an issue costs a lot less than putting boots on the ground in that area.
Yeah.
Also, changing the different ways that aid is sent. So I think a lot of people talk about how the U.S. Helps Israel and is an ally with Israel, and they're kind of bringing that into question, and how I think a lot of that aid is contingent upon how Israel behaves itself. Similarly, like countries that are committing atrocities usually don't get aid and that kind of a thing. But then with the consistent series of reprisals that we've seen with the Israel-Palestine conflict over the past X period of time, it's pretty nasty to manage whenever you have the Israeli people are also having atrocities inflicted upon them. So there isn't really an easy fix, and it's a lot harder to put things into clear good guy and bad guy categories. But man, the news on Israel-Palestine is so loud and buzzing right now compared to a lot of other stuff that's happening that just isn't quite as linked in with I guess it's the Western world's like media cycle. But we did touch on Sudan today, and the situation in Burma continues. There's still the war in Ukraine, which some people were asking for an update on that. I just replied in chat that it's pretty heavily stalemated, so you didn't really have a major update yet.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens next year, but for the next couple months at least, it's probably not going to see a lot of major developments, at least not on the battlefield. There might be changes in strategy, personnel changes. I don't doubt that both Russia and Ukraine are seriously considering and weighing major changes to the way they approach the war. But I don't think we'll see the results of those decisions until probably next year, would be my guess.
Gotcha. Well, Bitter Sugar's still hanging in there. I saw he recently got a promotion in Dota to a higher rank, so he's had at least some free time to kick some butt in video games, which is good to see.
Yeah, I hope he's doing well.
Mm-hmm.
That's a rough card to be dealt.
Yeah, for sure. Chat saying Ukraine has a lot of updates, actually. Oh, of course. But relative to the start of the conflict, the amount of things that have been happening have relatively slowed down.
Oh, yeah, I can see it in chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we talked about the river crossing last week. That's not new.
Mm-hmm.
There hasn't been much change on that either.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes.
There was someone in chat who pointed to a Bible verse. We were talking about the Crusades earlier. This is the Bible verse that may have been used to justify a lot of the marauding and banditry and so on, which you have to interpret this in a violent way, but it's Matthew 10:34 and 36. This is a quote from Jesus. He said, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be members of one's own household." So My interpretation of this as a Christian would have been that Christianity, when it was first propagating, was inherently going against the status quo of Jewish tradition and also Roman tradition, which Jerusalem was controlled by Rome at the time. So in that sense, it is an ideology that is against the status quo. And I think he was speaking figuratively there, because I don't recall Jesus actually chopping people with the sword. Again, this is like something that's probably been translated multiple times, but I could definitely see how you could interpret that couple of verses in a way that is like, yeah, we should go fuck shit up, do some crusades. Jesus said he's bringing a sword. We can bring the swords too. Yeah. People are shouting out Crusader Kings, the video game. Have you played that?
Crusade? I have not. I should. It's kind of been on my to-do list for like 10 years, but I have not yet played it.
I have not played that one either.
I actually have it. I think I got it on the cheap as part of a Humble Bundle a couple years ago.
Crusader Kings 3 has a 9 out of 10 on Steam, which is pretty good.
It's pretty solid.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was I? The story you told reminded me of a story that I'd been thinking about recently. It was, there was a scandal. This was a long time ago. This was like almost 20 years ago. Actually, I think it was 20 years ago. Would have been like 2003, 2004-ish, I want to say. And it was a minor scandal, but, it did pop up and catch my attention. Supposedly, the manufacturer of bullets, specifically small arms, for, the U.S. Army in Iraq at the time, I believe it was, if not also Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, the manufacturer of bullets for the Army was actually inscribing a verse onto the bullets it was making.
Oh, really?
Well, not the full verse. It was like, what do you call like the numbers that refer to the verse?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I don't know what that notation is referred to as. It's the book of the Bible and then the chapter and the verse.
Yeah. So they were doing that. They were putting that on each round that they produced, and it referred to a specific verse in the Bible.
Do you remember what it was?
That had to do? Huh? I actually don't. I need to look it up. But it was considered highly inflammatory given the context of a largely Christian United States fighting a war against a largely Muslim Middle Eastern country.
Trying to Google this. Was it? There's one that was mounted onto optical sights for rifles. That's Revelation 21:23.
Maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe it was something like that rather than the actual bullets.
The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb its lamp. Is its lamp. I wonder if that was the verse. Just randomly Googled it and that came up.
I do remember that the government made them stop very quickly after it went public.
Mm-hmm.
Because the optics were just awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, the government had to kind of go out of its way in the early war on terror to make it clear to everybody that this is not a religious war. We are not on crusade in the Middle East against Muslim heathens. And it's telling that they had to do that, because there definitely were some people at the time who thought of the conflict in those terms.
Yeah.
And there were not a few of them in the U.S. military at the time.
See, Whiskey is saying that I could see them putting that on bullets for handguns, but if it was put onto a rifle, that would really make the accuracy worse. That's true. When you're traveling at that much speed, you want to make sure you're at least mostly aerodynamic. Well, cool. I appreciate you. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, did you get a chance to see that documentary I linked to you?
I did not see it yet.
Oh, okay. Just checking.
Yeah. I recently just scored an apartment with my girlfriend in LA, so that's been my
LA.
yeah.
Oh,
It's pretty
wow.
close to where she lives. So I'm gonna be able to sign up for like acting gigs and stuff. I've always had in the back of my mind it would be cool to take a stab at acting, but I haven't really seized the opportunity. And it is a
Oh, wow.
relatively expensive area to live in, but it does have a lot of
Yeah.
opportunity in that sense. So
Oh, that's really cool. That's a big step up for you. Congrats.
yeah, she was saying that based on the culture of how a lot of people behave in the city, if you just show up on time and you're polite to people, you'll just be a breath of fresh air. So
Given the things I've heard about LA, I imagine there's some truth to that.
yeah. One thing that I do that she found interesting that's very Texan is I address people as sir and ma'am if they're an adult and I don't really know them super well, just out of respect. In growing up in Texas, like we were told that whenever we're going to a friend's house, you address the parents, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. And I
Yeah.
was addressing Trisha's parents that way on the East Coast, and she was like, I don't know if my dad has ever been called sir like that before.
Yeah. Well, go to it, Neuro. Spread our Texan ways far and wide.
Yeah, it is good to have some manners and polite ways of treating each other.
Yeah. Stay safe down there. It's supposed to be a little risky in LA now, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm going from Seattle, which is also considered to be risky.
Is it?
Yes.
Really?
Seattle is, yeah, it's one of the main cities that lots of news outlets like to bash as being overrun with homeless and crime.
Huh.
Yeah.
Would have thought LA would be in a league of its own given all the negative coverage, but I guess not.
It's a massive urban sprawl, too, so like
That's
Chad's saying,
true.
it depends on where.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of variance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, it'll be better than Dallas in the 90s.
Yeah.
That's a very low bar.
Mm-hmm.
So you should be okay. I remember back in the 90s, Dallas used to compete with Detroit for #1 in the country for violent homicide.
That's not something that you want to win the contest for.
Yeah.
Or get second place. That's still pretty bad.
Yeah, you're telling me. It's gotten better since then, but yeah, I do remember that. Well, cool, man. LA. Wow, you're going Hollywood.
Yeah. Bringing it to them. We'll see
Awesome.
how it goes. Yeah, we do have the longer term goal of potentially moving out somewhere that's more in nature and stuff, but while we're young and have fewer attachments, it would be a cool thing
Yeah.
to roll the dice on.
Gotcha. That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Appreciate you coming on as always and helping us break down these very spicy topics. Chat, I want to give you a pat on the back. You did all right tonight. There weren't crazy fights. And we did mention Israel and Palestine, and the names Trump and Biden were said, and no one lost their shit. So well done to all of you in chat. If anyone in YouTube wants to give us a scathing review or correct anything, feel free to do so. If you have any firsthand accounts of stuff that's going on, feel free to weigh in as well. And thank you very much, Agent Smith, for your time. I give you your usual 20-minute walk. And did you do the push-ups last time?
I did, and I did them today, too.
He did them today. Then I will issue the same challenge, but add 5 push-ups to it.
Oh, 15.
He's doing his montage. Let's go 1 week at a time.
A very slow, flabby montage.
Just wait. Soon you'll be jacked. And I'll say, remember that one time I challenged you to a 20-minute walk? Yep.
Well, before we go, I was going to ask, how's your adventure with God's Horniest Heroes going?
Oh, and Baldur's Gate?
Yeah.
I haven't actually been able to play it that much recently. I have a monk playthrough, and then I started to mess with hybrid classes. So I'm basically like stuck in my storyline because now I realize you can multi-class. So I'm just like messing with multi-classing and the characters and not actually making progress. I didn't even finish the main story yet. So I need to do that.
Gotcha. All right. I'll keep my lips sealed then. I won't spoil anything.
Chat really likes that title. God's Horniest Heroes, also known as Baldur's Gate 3.
It's pretty appropriate given the way the game goes.
Absolutely. Well, you take care of yourself, sir. Thank you for coming on, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.